The Pirates of Ersatz by Murray Leinster, Part 3. The sun set, and the sky twinkled with darting lights which flew toward the west and vanished. Twilight followed, and more lights flashed across the heavens as if pursuing the sun. Fanny had learned to associate 3 and then 9 such lights with spacecraft, but she could not dream of a fleet of hundreds. She dismissed the lights from her mind, being much more concerned with Hoddan. He would be in as bad a fix as ever if he came out of the boat. Twilight remained, a fairy half-light in which all things looked much more charming than they really were. And Don Loris, reduced to peevish sputtering by pure mystery, summoned Thal to him. It should be remembered that Don Loris knew nothing of the disappearance of the spaceboat from his neighbor's land. He knew nothing of Thal's journey with Hoddan, but he did remember that Hoddan seemed unworried at breakfast and explained his calm by saying that he had a secret. The feudal chieftain worried lest this spaceboat be it. "Thal," said Don Loris peevishly, sitting beside the great fireplace in the enormous, drafty hall, "you know this Bron Hoddan better than anybody else." Thal breathed heavily. He turned pale. "Where is he?" demanded Don Loris. "I don't know," said Thal. It was true, so far as he was concerned. Hoddan had vanished into the sky. "What does he plan to do?" demanded Don Loris. "I don't know," said Thal helplessly. "Where does that thing outside the castle come from?" "I don't know," said Thal. Don Loris drummed on the arm of his intricately carved chair. "I don't like people who don't know things," he said fretfully. "There must be somebody in that thing. Why don't they show themselves? What are they here for? Why did they come down, especially here? Because of Bron Hoddan?" "I don't know," said Thal humbly. "Then go find out," snapped Don Loris. "Take a reasonable guard with you. The thing must have a door. Knock on it and ask who's inside and why they came here. Tell them I sent you to ask." Thal saluted. With his teeth tending to chatter, he gathered a half-dozen of his fellows and went tramping out the castle gate. Some of the half-dozen had been involved in the rescue of the Lady Fanny from Geck. They were still in a happy mood because of the plunder they'd brought back. It was much more than a mere retainer could usually hope for in a year. "What's this all about, Thal?" demanded one of them as Thal arranged them in 2 lines to make a proper military appearance, spears dressed upright and garrison shields on their left arms. "FRRRRD Harch?" barked Thal, and they swung into motion. 2, 3, 4, hup 2, 3, 4. Hup 2, 3. The cadence was established, Thal said gloomily. "Don Loris said to find out who landed that thing out yonder, and he keeps asking me about Bron Hoddan too." He strode in step with the others. The 7 men made an impressively soldierly group, tramping away from the castle wall. "What happened to him?" asked a rear-file man. He marched on, eyes front, chest out, spear shaft swinging splendidly in time with his marching. "That lad has a nose for loot. Don't take it himself, though. If he's set up in business as a chieftain now." "Hup 2, 3, 4, muttered Thal. "Hup 2, 3, Don Loris a hard chieftain," growled the right-hand man in the second file. "Plenty of grub and beer, but no fighting and no loot. I didn't get to go with you characters the other day, but what you brought back." "Wasn't half of what was there," mourned a front-file man. "Wasn't half. Those pistols he issued got shot out and we had to get out of there fast. HMMM. Here's this thing, Thal. What do we do with it?" "HRR. Halt," barked Thal. He stared at the motionless, seemingly lifeless, shapeless spaceboat. He'd seen one like it earlier today. That one spouted fire and went up out of sight. He was wary of this one. He grumbled. "Those pipes in the back of it, steer clear of him. They spit fire, no door on this side." Don Loris said knock on the door. "We go around the front." "FRRRRD Harch? 2, 3, 4, hup 2, 3, 4. Left turn here and mind those rocks. Don Loris give us hell if somebody fell down." Left turn again, hup 2, 3, 4. The 7 men tramped splendidly around the front of the life. On the far side, its bulk hid even Don Loris Castle from view. The 6 spearmen with Thal came to a second halt. "Here goes," rumbled Thal. "I tell you boys, if she starts to spit fire, you get the hell away." He marched up to the spaceboat's port. He knocked on it. There was no response. He knocked again. Hoddan opened the door. He nodded cheerfully to Thal. "Afternoon, Thal. Glad to see you. I've been hoping you'd come." "Over this way. Who's with you?" He peered through the semi-darkness. "Some of the boys, eh? Come in," he beckoned and said casually. Lean your spears against the hull there. Thal hesitated and was lost. The others obeyed. There were clatterings as the steel spearheads came to rest against the metal hull. 6 of Don Loris retainers followed Thal admiringly into the spaceboat's interior to gaze at it and that Bron Hoddan who so recently had given 3 of them and nearly half a score of their fellows the chance to loot a nearby castle. "Sit down," said Hoddan cordially. "If you want to feel what a spaceboat's really like, clasp the seat belts around you. You'll feel exactly like you're about to make a journey out of atmosphere. That's it. Lean back. You notice there are no viewports in the hull. That's because we use these vision screens to see around with." He flicked on the screens. Thal and his companions were charmed to see the landscape outside portrayed on screens. Hoddan shifted the sensitivity point toward infrared, and details came out that would have been invisible to the naked eye. "With the boat port closed," said Hoddan, "like this." The port clanged shut and grumbled for half a second as the locking dogs went home. "We're all set for takeoff. I need only get into the pilot's seat." He did so. "And throw on the fuel pump." A tiny humming sounded. "And we move when I advance this throttle." He pressed the firing stud. There was a soul-shaking roar. There was a terrific pressure. The 7 men from Don Loris' stronghold were pressed back in their seats with an overwhelming, irresistible pressure which held them absolutely helpless. Their mouths dropped open. Appalled protests tried to come out, but were pushed back by the seemingly ever-increasing acceleration. The screens, showing the outside, displayed a great and confused tumult of smoke and fumes and dust to rearward. They showed only stars ahead. Those stars grew brighter and brighter as the roar of the rockets diminished to a merely deafening sound. Suddenly the disk of the local sun appeared, rising above the horizon to the west. The spaceboat, naturally, overtook it as it rose into an orbit headed east to west instead of the other way about. Presently Hoddan turned off the fuel pump. He turned to look thoughtfully at the 7 men. They were very pale. They sat unanimously very still because they could see in the vision plates that a strange, mottled, again sunlit surface flowed past them with an appalling velocity. They were very much afraid that they knew what it was. They did. It was the surface of the planet Darth, well below them. "I'm glad you boys came along," said Hoddan. "We'll catch up with the fleet in a moment or two. The pirate fleet, you know. I'm very pleased with you. Not many groundlings would volunteer for space piracy, not even with the loot there is in it." Thal choked slightly, but no one else made a sound. No one even protested. Protests would have been no use. There were looks of anguish, but nothing else, because Hoddan was the only one in the spaceboat who had the least idea of how to get it down again. His passengers had to go along for the ride he'd taken them for, no matter where it led. Numbly, they waited for what would befall. Hoddan did not worry about his followers, captives, noting the obsolescence of the space fleet into which they presently drifted. Ancient hulks and impractical oddities did not seem antique or freakish to them. They had no standards in such matters. The planet Darth seemed slightly off to one side in space, at some times, and at others, it seemed underfoot, while at others it looked directly overhead. At all times, it moved visibly, while the spaceboat and the ships in orbit seemed merely to float in nearly fixed positions. When the dark part of Darth appeared to roll toward the spaceboat again, all the bright specks which were ships about them winked out of sight, and there were only faraway stars and a vast blackness off to one side like nothingness made visible. The spearmen were wholly subdued when there was light once more and eccentric shapes around them. There was a ring ship, the hull like a metal wheel with a huge tire, with pipe passages from the tire part to the hub where the control room was located. It seemed unbelievable that such a relic could still exist, dating as it did from the period before gravity fields could be put into spacecraft. It would have provided a crazy sort of gravity by spinning as it limped from one place to another. Whoever had collected this fleet for the emigrants from Colin must have required only one thing, that there be a hull. Given something that would hold air, a Lawler drive, a gravity unit, and air apparatus would turn it into a ship that could go into overdrive and hence cross the galaxy at need. Those who bargained with the emigrants had been content to furnish nothing more than that, but this could not be appreciated by Hoddan's involuntary crew. The spaceboat drew up alongside the gigantic hulk, which was the leader's. The 7 Darthians were still numbed by their kidnapping and the situation in which they found themselves. They looked with dull eyes at the mountainous object they approached. It had actually been designed as a fighter carrier of space, intended to carry smaller craft to fight non-existent warships under conditions which never came about. It must have been sold for scrap a couple of 100 years since, and patched up for this emigration. Hoddan waited for the huge door to open. It did. He headed into the opening, noticing as he did so that an object 2 or 3 times the size of the spaceboat was already there. It cut down the room for maneuvering, but a thing once done is easier thereafter. Hoddan got the boat inside, and there was a very small scraping and the great door closed before the boat could drift out again. Hoddan turned to his companions, followers, victims, once the spaceboat was still. "This," he said in a manner which could only be described as one of smiling ferocity, "is a pirate ship belonging to the pirate fleet we passed through on the way here. It's manned by characters so murderous that their leaders don't dare. And anywhere away from their home star cluster or all the galaxy would combine against them to exterminate them or be exterminated. You've joined that fleet. You're going to get out of this boat and march over that ship yonder. Then you're going to be space pirates under me." They quivered, but did not protest. "I'll try you for one voyage," he told them. "There will be plunder, there will be pirate revels, if you serve faithfully and I'll return you to Don Loris' stronghold with your loot after the one voyage. If you don't," he grinned mirthlessly at them, "out the airlock with you to float forever between the stars. Understand?" The last was pure savagery. They cringed. The outside pressure meter went up to normal. Hoddan turned off the vision screens, so ending any view of the interior of the hold. He opened the port and went out, sitting in something like continued paralysis in their seats. The 7 spearmen of Darth heard his voice in conversation outside the boat. They could catch no words, but Hoddan's tone was strictly businesslike. He came back. "All right," he said shortly. "Thal, march him over." Thal gulped. He loosened his seat belt. The enlistment of the 7 in the pirate fleet was tacitly acknowledged. They were unarmed save for the conventional large knives at their belts. "F. RRD Harch?" rasped Thal with a lump in his throat. 234. Hup 234. Hup. 7 men marched dismally out of the spaceboat and down to the floor of the huge hold. Eyes front, chests out, throats dry, they marched to the larger but still small vessel that shared this hold compartment. They marched into that ship. Thal barked, "Halt," and they stopped. They waited. Hoddan came in very matter-of-factly only moments later. He closed the entrance port, so sealing the ship. He nodded approvingly. "You can break ranks now," he said. "There's food and such stuff around. The ship's yours. But don't turn knobs or push buttons until you've asked me what for." He went forward, and a door closed behind him. He looked at the control board and could have done with a little information himself. When the ship was built, generations ago, there'd been controls installed, which would be quite useless now. When the present working instruments were installed, it had been done so hastily that the wires and relays behind them were not concealed, and it was these that gave him the clues to understand them. The Space Ark's door opened. Hoddan backed his ship out. Its rockets had surprising power. He reflected that the Lawler drive wouldn't have been designed for this present ship, either. There'd probably been a quantity order for so many Lawler drives, and they'd been installed on whatever needed a modern drive system, which was every ship in the fleet. But since this was one of the smallest craft in the lot, with its low mass it should be fast. "We'll see," he said to nobody in particular, out in emptiness, but naturally sharing the orbit of the ship from which it had just come. Hoddan tried it out tentatively. He got the feel of it. Then, as a matter of simple, rule-of-thumb astrogation, he got from a low orbit to a 5-diameter height where the Lawler drive would take hold by mere touches of rocket power. It was simply a matter of stretching the orbit to extreme eccentricity as all the ships went round the planet. After the 4th go-round, he was fully 5 diameters out at aphelion. He touched the Lawler drive button, and everybody had that very peculiar disturbance of all their senses which accompanies going into overdrive. The small craft sped through emptiness at a high multiple of the speed of light. Hoddan's knowledge of astrogation was strictly practical. He went over his ship. From a look at it outside, he'd guessed that it once had been a yacht. Various touches inside verified that idea. There were 2 staterooms. All the hull space was for living and supplies. None was for carg. He nodded. There was a faint mustiness about it. But there'd been a time when it was some rich man's pride. He went back to the control room to make an estimate. From the pilot's seat one could see a speck of brightness directly ahead. Infinitesimal dots of brightness appeared, grew swiftly brighter, and then darted outward. As they darted, they disappeared because their motion became too swift to follow. There were, of course, methods of measuring this phenomenon so that one could get an accurate measure of one's speed in overdrive. Hoddan had no instrument for the purpose, but he had the feel of things. This was a very fast ship indeed, at full Lawler thrust. Presently he went out to the central cabin. His followers had found provisions. There were novelties, hydroponic fruit, for instance, and they'd gloomily stuffed themselves. They were almost resigned now. Memory of the loot he'd led other men to at Gex Castle inclined them to be hopeful, but they looked uneasy when he stopped where they were gathered. "Well," he said sharply. Thal swallowed. "We have been companions, Bron Hoddan," he said unhappily. "We fought together in great battles, 2 against 50, and we plundered the slain." "True enough," agreed Hoddan. If Thal wanted to edit his memories of the fighting at the spaceport, that was all right with him. "Now we're headed for something much better." "But what?" asked Thal miserably. "Here we are high above our native world." "Oh no," said Hoddan. "You couldn't even pick out its sun from where we are now." Thal gulped. "I do not understand what you want with us," he protested. "We are not experienced in space. We are simple men. You're pirates now," Hoddan told him with a sort of genial bloodthirstiness. "You'll do what I tell you until you fight. Then you'll fight well or die. That's all you need to know." He left them. When men are to be led, it is rarely wise to discuss policy or tactics with them. Most men work best when they know only what is expected of them. Then they can't get confused, and they do not get ideas of how to do things better. Hoddan inspected the yacht more carefully. There were still traces of decorative features which had nothing to do with space worth. But the mere antiquity of the ship made Hoddan hunt more carefully. He found a small compartment packed solidly with supplies. A supply cabinet did not belong where it was. He hauled out stuff to make sure. It had been a machine shop in miniature. In the early days, before space phones were long-range devices, a yacht or a ship that went beyond orbital distance was strictly on its own. If there were a breakdown, it was strictly private. It had to repair itself or else. So all early spacecraft carried amazingly complete equipment for repairs. Only liners are equipped that way in recent generations, and it is almost unheard of for their tool shops to be used. But there was the remnant of a shop on the yacht that Hoddan had in hand for his errand to Walden. He'd told the emigrant leaders that he went to ask for charity. He'd just assured his followers that their journey was for piracy. Now, he began to empty the cubbyhole of all the items that had been packed into it for storage. It had been very ingenious, this miniature repair shop. The lathe was built in with strength members of the walls as part of its structure. The drill press was recessed. The welding apparatus had its coils and condensers under the floor. The briefest of examinations showed the condensers to be in bad shape, and the coils might be hopeless, but there was good material used in the old days. Hoddan began to have quite unreasonable hopes. He went back to the control room to meditate. He'd had a reasonably sound plan of action for the pirating of a space liner, even though he had no weapons mounted on the ship, nor anything more deadly than stun pistols for his reluctant crew. But he considered it likely that he could make the same sort of landing with his yacht that he'd already done with the spaceboat, which should be enough. If he waited off Walden until a liner went down to the planet's great spaceport, he could try it. He would go into a close orbit around Walden, which would bring him, very low, over the landing grid within an hour or so of the liner's landing. He'd turn the yacht end for end and apply full rocket power for deceleration. The yacht would drop like a stone into the landing grid. Everything would happen too quickly for the grid crew to think of clapping a force field on it, or for them to manage it if they tried. He'd be aground before they realized it. The rest was simply fast action. Hoddan and 7 Darthians, stun pistols humming, would tumble out of the yacht and dash for the control room of the grid. Hoddan would smash the controls. Then they'd rush the landed liner, seize it, shoot down anybody who tried to oppose them, and seal up the ship, and then they'd take off. On the liner's rockets, which were carried for emergency landing only, but could be used for a single takeoff. After one such use they'd be exhausted, And with the grid's controls smashed, nobody could even try to stop them. It wasn't a bad idea. He had a good deal of confidence in it. It was the reason for his Darthian crew. Nobody'd expect such a thing to be tried, so it almost certainly could be done. But it did have the drawback that the yacht would have to be left behind, a dead loss when the liner was seized. Hoddan thought it over soberly. Long before he reached Walden, of course, he could have his own crew so terrified that they'd fight like fiends for fear of what he might do to them if they didn't. But if he could keep the space yacht also, he nodded gravely. He liked the new possibility. If it didn't work, there was the first plan in reserve. In any case, he'd get a modern space liner and a suitable cargo to present to the emigrants of Colin. And afterward, there were certain electronic circuits which were akin. The Lawler drive unit formed a force field, a stress in space, into which a nearby ship necessarily moved. The faster-than-light angle came from the fact that it worked like a donkey trotting after a carrot. Held in front of him by a stick, the ship moving into the stressed area moved the stress. The force fields of a landing grid were similar. A tuning principle was involved, but basically a landing grid clamped an area of stress around a spaceship and the ship couldn't move out of it. When the landing grid moved the stressed area up or down, why, that was it. All this was known to everybody. But a third trick had been evolved on Zan. It was based on the fact that ball lightning could be generated by a circuit fundamentally akin to the other two. Ball lightning was an area of space so stressed that its energy content could leak out only very slowly, unless it made contact with a conductor when all bets were off. It blew. And the Zan pirates used ball lightning to force the surrender of their victims. Hoddan began to draw diagrams. The Lawler drive unit had been installed. Long after the yacht was built, it would be modern, with no nonsense about it. With such and such of its electronic components cut out, and such other ones cut in, it would become a perfectly practical ball lightning generator, capable of placing bolts wherever one wanted them. This was standard Zan practice. Hoddan's grandfather had used it for years. It had the advantage that it could be used inside a gravity field, where a Lawler drive could not. It had the other advantage that commercial spacecraft could not mount such gadgets for defense, because the insurance companies objected to meddling with Lawler drive installations. Hoddan set to work with the remnants of a tool shop on the ancient yacht, and some antique coils and condensers and such. He became filled with zest. He almost forgot that he was the skipper of an elderly craft which should have been scrapped before he was born. But even he grew hungry, and he realized that nobody offered him food. He went indignantly into the yacht's central saloon and found his 7 crew members snoring stertorously, sprawled in stray places here and there. He woke them with great sternness. He set them furiously to work on that housekeeping, including meals, which can be neglected in a feudal castle because strong outside winds blow smells and dry up smelly objects, but which must be practiced in a spaceship. He went back to work. Suddenly, he stopped and meditated afresh and ceased his actual labor to draw a diagram which he regarded with great affection. He returned to his adaptation of the Lawler drive to the production of ball lightning. It was possible to wind coils. A certain percentage of the old condensers held a charge. He tapped the drive unit for a brazing current, and the drill press became a die-stamping device for small parts. He built up the elements of a vacuum tube such as is normally found only in a landing grid control room. He set up a vacuum valve arrangement in the base of a large glass jar. He put that jar in the boat's airlock, bled the air to emptiness, and flashed the tube's quaint elements. He brought it back and went out of overdrive while he hooked the entire new assembly into the drive circuit, with cutouts and switches to be operated from the yacht's instrument board. Finished, he examined the stars. The nearby suns were totally strange in their arrangement, but the Coalsack area was a space mark good for half a sector of the galaxy. There was a condensation in the nearer rim for a second bearing, and a certain calcium cloud with a star cluster behind it was as good as a highway sign. For locating oneself, he lined up the yacht again and went into overdrive once more. 2 days later he came out, again surveyed the cosmos, again went into overdrive, again came out, once more made a hop in faster-than-light travel. And he was in the solar system of which Walden was the ornament and pride. He used the telescope and contemplated Walden on its screen. The space yacht moved briskly toward it. His Evendarthian crewmen, aware of coming action, dolefully sharpened their 2-foot knives. They did not know what else to do, but they were far from happy. Hoddan shared their depression. Such gloomy anticipations before stirring events are proof that a man is not a fool. Hoddan's grandfather had been known to observe that, when a man can imagine all kinds of troubles and risks and disasters ahead of him, he is usually right. Hoddan shared that view, but it would not do to back out now. He examined Walden painstakingly while the yacht sped on. He saw an ocean come out of the twilight zone of dawn. By the charts, the capital city and the spaceport should be on that ocean's western shore. After a suitable and very long interval, the sight of the capital city came around the edge of the planet. From a bare 100,000 miles, Hoddan stepped up magnification to its limit. And looked again. Then Walden more than filled the telescope's field. He could see only a very small fraction of the planet's surface. He had to hunt before he found the capital city again. Then it was very clear. He saw the curving lines of its highways and the crisscross pattern of its streets. Buildings as such, however, did not show. But he made out the spaceport and the shadow of the landing grid, and in the very center of that grid there was something silvery which cast a shadow of its own. A ship. A liner. There was a tap on the control room door. "Thal, anything happening?" he asked uneasily. "I just sighted the ship we're going to take," said Hoddan. Thal looked unhappy. He withdrew. Hoddan plotted out the extremely roundabout course he must take to end up with the liner and the yacht traveling in the same direction and the same speed, so capture would be possible. He put the yacht on the line required. He threw on full power. Actually, he headed partly away from his intended victim. The little yacht plunged forward. Nothing seemed to happen. Time passed. Hoddan had nothing to do but worry. He worried. Thal tapped on the door again. "About time to get ready to fight?" he asked dolefully. "Not yet," said Hoddan. "I'm running away from our victim now." Another half hour. The course changed. The yacht was around. Behind Walden. The whole planet lay between it and its intended prey. The course of the small ship curved now. It would pass almost close enough to clip the topmost tips of Walden's atmosphere. There was nothing for Hoddan to do but think morbid thoughts. He thought them. The Lawler drive began to burble. He cut it off. He sat gloomily in the control room, occasionally glancing at the nearing expanse of rushing mottled surface presented by the now nearby planet. Its attraction bent the path of the yacht. It was now a parabolic curve. Presently the surface diminished a little. The yacht was increasing its distance from it. Hoddan used the telescope. He searched the space ahead with full-width field. He found the liner. It rose steadily. The grid still thrust it upward with an even, continuous acceleration. It had to be not less than 40,000 miles out before it could take to overdrive, but at that distance it would have an outward velocity which would take it on out indefinitely. At 10,000 miles, certainly, the grid fields would let go. They did. Hoddan could tell because the liner had been pointed base down toward the planet when the force fields picked it up. Now it wobbled slightly. It was free. It was no longer held solidly. From now on it floated up on momentum. Hoddan nibbled at his fingernails. There was nothing to be done for 40 minutes more. Presently there was nothing to be done for 30. For 20, 10, 5, 3, 2. The liner was barely 20 miles away when Hoddan fired his rockets. They made a colossal cloud of vapor in emptiness. The yacht stirred faintly, shifted deftly, lost just a suitable amount of velocity, which now was nearly straight up from the planet, and moved with precision and directness. Aboard the liner, Hoddan stirred his controls and swung the whole small ship. Here, obviously, he could not use the space drive for its proper purpose. But a switch cut out certain elements of the Lawler unit and cut in those others which made the modified drive unit into a ball lightning projector. A flaming speck of pure incandescence sped from the yacht through emptiness. It would miss, no. Hoddan swerved it. It struck the liner's hull. It would momentarily paralyze every bit of electric equipment in the ship. It would definitely not go unnoticed. "Calling liner," said Hoddan painfully into a microphone. "Calling liner, we are pirates attacking your ship. You have 10 seconds to get into your lifeboats or we will hull you." He settled back, again nibbling at his fingernails. He was acutely disturbed. At the end of 10 seconds, the distance between the two ships was Perceptibly less, he flung a second ball lightning bolt across the diminished space. He sent it whirling round and round the liner in a tight spiral. He ended by having it touch the liner's bow. Liquid light ran over the entire hull. "Your 10 seconds are up," he said worriedly. "If you don't get out," but then he relaxed. A boat blister on the liner opened. The boat did not release itself. It could not possibly take on its limit of passengers and crew in so short a time. The opening of the blister was a sign of surrender. The 2 first ball lightning bolts were miniatures. Hoddan now projected a full-sized ball. It glittered viciously in emptiness, the plasma gas necessary for its existence furnishing a medium for radiation. It sped toward the liner and hung off its side menacingly. The yacht from Darth moved steadily closer. 5 miles, 2, all out, said Hoddan regretfully. "We can't wait any longer." A boat darted away from the liner. A second, a third and fourth and fifth. The last boat lingered desperately. The yacht was less than a mile away when it broke free and plunged frantically toward the planet it had left a little while before. The other boats were already streaking downward, trails of rocket fumes expanding behind them. The crew of the landing grid would pick them up for a safe and gentle landing. Hoddan sighed in relief. He played delicately upon the yacht's rocket controls. He carefully maneuvered the very last of the novelties he had built into an originally simple Lawler drive unit. The 2 ships came together with a distinct clanking sound. It seemed horribly loud. Thal jerked open the door, ashen white. "We hit something. When do we fight?" Hoddan said ruefully. "I forgot." "A fighting's over, but bring your stun pistols. Nobody'd stay behind, but somebody might have gotten left." He rose to take over the captured ship. Normally, at overdrive cruising speed, it would be a week's journey from Walden to the planet Krim. Hoddan made it in 5 days. There was reason. He wanted to beat the news of his piracy to Krim. He could endure suspicion, and he wouldn't mind doubt, but he did not want certainty, his nefarious behavior to interfere with the purposes of his call. The space yacht, sealed tightly, floated in an orbit far out in emptiness. The big ship went down alone by landing grid. It glittered brightly as it descended. When it touched ground and the grid's force fields cut off, it looked very modern and very crisp and strictly businesslike. Actually, the capture of this particular liner was a bit of luck for Hoddan. It was not one of the giant intercluster ships which make runs of thousands of light years and deign to stop only at very major planets. It was a medium ship of 5,000 tons burden, designed for service in the Horsehead Nebula region. It was brand new and on the way from its builders to its owners when Hoddan interfered. Naturally, though, it carried cargo on its maiden voyage. Hoddan spoke curtly to the control room of the grid. "I'm Unsked," he explained. "New ship. I got a freak charter party over on Walden and I have to get rid of my cargo. How about shifting me to a delay space until I can talk to some brokers?" The force fields came on again, and the liner moved very delicately to a position at the side of the grid's central space. There it would be out of the way. Hoddan dressed himself carefully in garments found in the liner's skipper's cabin. He found Thal wearing an apron and an embittered expression. He ceased to wield a mop as Hoddan halted before him. "I'm going ashore," said Hoddan crisply. "You're in charge until I get back." "In charge of what?" demanded Thal bitterly. "Of a bunch of male housemaids. I run a mop and me a Darthian gentleman. I thought I was being a pirate. What do? I scrub floors, I wash paint, I stencil cases in cargo holds. I paint over names and put others in their places. Me, a Darthian gentleman." "No," said Hoddan. "A pirate. If I don't get back, you and the others can't work this ship, and presently the police of Krim will ask why. They'll recheck my careful forgeries, and you'll all be hung for piracy. So don't let anybody in. Don't talk to anybody. If you do, PFFT." He drew his finger across his throat and nodded and went cheerfully out the crew's landing door in the very base of the ship. He went across the tarmac and out between 2 of the gigantic steel arches of the grid. He hired a ground vehicle. "Where?" asked the driver. "HMMM," said Hoddan. "There's a firm of lawyers. I can't remember the name." "There's millions of them," said the driver. "This is a special one," explained Hoddan. "It's so dignified they won't talk to you unless you're a great-grand son of a client. They're so ethical they won't touch a case of under 1,000,000 credits. They've got about 19 names in the firm title and—" "Oh," said the ground car driver. "That'll be hell. I can't remember the name either, but I'll take you there." He drove out into traffic. Hoddan relaxed. Then he tensed again. He had not been in a city since he stopped briefly in this on the way to Darth. The traffic was abominable. And he, who'd been in various pitched battles on Darth and had only lately captured a ship in space. Hoddan grew apprehensive as his ground car charged into the thick of hooting, rushing, squealing vehicles. When the car came to a stop, he was relieved. "It's yonder," said the driver. "You'll find the name on the directory." Hoddan paid and went inside the gigantic building. He looked at the directory and shrugged. He went to the downstairs guard. He explained that he was looking for a firm of lawyers whose name was not on the directory list. They were extremely conservative and of the highest possible reputation. They didn't seek clients, 42 and 43, said the guard, frowning. "I ain't supposed to give it out, but floors 42 and 3. Hoddan went up. He was unknown. A receptionist looked at him with surprised aversion. "I have a case of space piracy," said Hoddan, polite. "A member of the firm, please." 10 minutes later, he eased himself into the easiest of easy chairs. A gray-haired man of infinite dignity said, "Well, I am," said Hoddan modestly, "a pirate. I have a ship in the spaceport with very convincing papers and a cargo of Rigelian furs, jewelry from the Ceres planets, and a rather large quantity of bulk melacynth. I want to dispose of the cargo and invest a considerable part of the proceeds in conservative stocks on Krim." The lawyer frowned. He looked shocked. Then he said carefully, "You made 2 statements. One was that you are a pirate. Taken by itself, that is not my concern. The other is that you wish to dispose of certain cargo and invest in reputable businesses on Krim. I assume that there is no connection between the 2 observations." He paused. Hoddan said nothing. The lawyer went on. "With dignity, of course our firm is not in the brokerage business. However, we can represent you in your dealing with local brokers, and obviously we can advise you." "I also wish to buy," said Hoddan, "a complete shipload of agricultural machinery, a microfilm technical library, machine tools, vision tape technical instructors, and libraries of tape for them, generators and such things." "HMMM," said the lawyer. "I'll send one of our clerks to examine your cargo so he can deal properly with the brokers. You will tell him in detail what you wish to buy." Hoddan stood up. "I'll take him to the ship now." He was mildly surprised at the smoothness with which matters proceeded. He took a young clerk to the ship. He showed him the ship's papers as edited by himself. He took him through the cargo holds. He discussed in some detail what he wished to buy. And the clerk left. Thal came to complain again. "Look here," he said bitterly. "We've scrubbed this ship from one end to the other. There's not a speck or a finger mark on it, and we're still scrubbing. We captured this ship." "Is this pirate revels?" Hoddan said. "There's money coming. I'll let you boys ashore with some cash in your pockets presently." Brokers came, escorted by the lawyer's clerk. They squabbled furiously with him, but the dignity of the firm he represented was extreme. There was no suspicion, no overt suspicion anyhow, and the furs went. The clerk painstakingly informed Hoddan that he could draw so much. More brokers came. The jewelry went. The lawyer's clerk jotted down figures and told Hoddan the net. The bulk melacynth was taken over by a group of brokers, none of whom could handle it alone. Hoddan drew cash and sent his Darthians ashore with 1,000 credits apiece. With bright and shining faces, they headed for the nearest bars. "As soon as my ship's loaded," Hoddan told the clerk, "I'll want to get them out of jail." The clerk nodded. He brought salesmen of agricultural machinery, representatives of microfilm libraries, manufacturers of generators, vision tape instructors, and allied lines. Hoddan bought painstakingly. Delivery was promised for the next day. "Now," said a clerk, "about the investments you wish to make with the balance." "I'll want a reasonable sum in cash," said Hoddan reflectively. "But, well, I've been told that insurance is a fine, conservative business. As I understand it, most insurance organizations are divided into divisions which are separately incorporated. There will be a life insurance division, a casualty division, and so on. Is that right? And one may invest in any of them separately," the clerk said impassively. "I was given to understand, sir, that you are interested in risk insurance, perhaps especially risk insurance covering piracy. I was given quotations on the risk insurance divisions of all Krim companies. Of course, those are not very active stocks, but if there were a rumor of a pirate ship acting in this part of the galaxy, one might anticipate." "I do," said Hoddan. "Let's see. My cargo brought so much. HMMM. My purchases will come to so much. HMMM. My legal fees, of course. I mentioned a sum in cash. Yes. This will be the balance, more or less, which you will put in the stocks you've named, but since I anticipate activity in them, I'll want to leave some special instructions. He gave a detailed, thoughtful account of what he anticipated might be found in news reports. Later dates. The clerk noted it all down impassively. Hoddan added instructions. Yes, sir, said the clerk without intonation when he was through. If you will come to the office in the morning, sir, the papers will be drawn up and matters can be concluded. Your new cargo can hardly be delivered before then, and if I may say so, sir, your crew won't be ready. I'd estimate 2 hours of festivity for each man and 14 hours for recovery. Thank you, said Hoddan. I'll see you in the morning. He sealed up the ship when the lawyer's clerk departed. Then he felt lonely. He was the only living thing in the ship. His footsteps echoed hollowly. There was nobody to speak to, not even anybody to threaten. He'd done a lot of threatening lately. He went forlornly to the cabin once occupied by the liner's former skipper. His loneliness increased. He began to feel those daunting self-doubts, such as plague the most unselfish and conscientious people. His actions to date, of course, did not trouble him. Today's actions were the ones which bothered his conscience. He felt that they were not quite adequate. The balance left in the lawyer's hands would not be nearly enough to cover a certain deficit which, in justice, he felt himself bound to make up. It had been his thought to make this enterprise self-lick. Dating, everybody concerned making a profit, including the owners of the ship and cargo he had pirated. But he wasn't sure. He reflected that his grandfather would not have been disturbed about such a matter. That elderly pirate would have felt wholly at ease. It was his conviction that piracy was an essential part of the working of the galaxy's economic system. Hoddan, indeed, could remember him saying precisely, snipping off the ends of his words as he spoke, I tell why, piracy's what keeps the galaxy's business thriving. Everybody knows business suffers when retail trade slacks down. It backs up the movement of inventories. They get too big. That backs up orders to the factories. They lay off men. And when men are laid off, they don't have money to spend. So retail trade slacks off some more, and that backs up inventories some more, and that backs up orders to factor. Reason makes unemployment and hurts retail trade again. It's a feedback, see? It was Hoddan's grandfather's custom at this point to stare shrewdly at each of his listeners in turn. But suppose somebody pirates a ship. The owners don't lose. It's insured. They order another ship built right away. Men get hired to build it, and they're paid money to spend in retail trade, and that moves inventories and industry picks up. Mourn that, meh? Or people insure against piracy. Insurance companies hire more clerks and bookkeepers. They get more money for retail trade and to move inventories and keep factories going and get more people hired. You see, it's piracy that keeps business in this galaxy going. Hoddan had known doubts about this, but it could not be entirely wrong. He'd put a good part of the proceeds of his piracy in risk insurance stocks, and he counted on them to make all his actions as benevolent to everybody concerned as his intentions had been and were. But it might not be true enough. It might be less than, well, sufficiently true in a particular instance. And therefore, then he saw how things could be worked out so that there could be no doubt. He began to work out the details. He drifted off to sleep in the act of composing a letter in his head to his grandfather on the pirate planet Zan. When morning came on Krim, Catahill trucks came bringing gigantic agricultural machines of a sort that would normally never be shipped by space freight. There came generators and turbines and tanks of plastic, and vision tape instructors and great boxes full of tape for them. There were machine tools and cutting tips, these last in vast quantity, and very many items that the emigrants of Colin probably would not expect and might not even recognize. The cargo holds of the liner filled. He went to the office of his attorneys. He read and signed papers in an atmosphere of great dignity and ethical purpose. The lawyer's clerk attended him to the police office, where 7 dreary Darthians with oversized hangovers tried dismally to cheer themselves by memories of how they got that way. He got them out and to the ship. The lawyer's clerk produced a rather weighty if small box with an air of extreme solemnity. "The currency you wanted, sir." "Thank you," said Hoddan. "That's the last of our business." "Yes, sir," said the clerk. He hesitated and for the first time showed a trace of human curiosity. "Could I ask a question, sir, about piracy?" "Why not?" asked Hoddan. "Go ahead. When you, captured this ship, sir," said the clerk hopefully, "did you, shoot the men and keep the women?" Hoddan sighed. "Much," he said regretfully, "as I hate to spoil an enlivening theory, no. These are modern days. Efficiency has invaded even the pirate business. I used my crew for floor scrubbing and cookery." He closed the ship port gently and went up to the control room to call the landing grid operators. In minutes, the captured liner loaded down again, lifted toward the stars, and all. The journey back to Darth was as anticlimactic as that. There was no trouble finding the space yacht in its remote orbit. Hoddan sent out an unlocking signal, and a keyed transmitter began to send a signal on which to home. When the liner nudged alongside it, Hoddan's last contrivance operated, and the yacht clung fast to the larger ship's hull. There were 4 days in overdrive. There were 3 or 4 pauses for position finding. The stopover on Krim had cost some delay, but Hoddan arrived back at a positive sight of Darth's sun within a day or so of standard space drive direct from Walden. Then, there was little or no time lost in getting into orbit with the junkyard space fleet of the emigrants. Shortly thereafter, he called the leader's ship with only mild worries about possible disasters that might have happened while he was away. "Calling the leader's ship," he said crisply. "Calling the leader's ship. This is Bron Hoddan, reporting back from Walden with a ship and machinery contributed for your use." The harsh voice of the bearded old leader of the emigrants seemed somehow broken when he replied. He called down blessings on Hoddan, who could use them. Then there was the matter of getting emigrants on board the new ship. They didn't know how to use the boat blister lifeboat tubes. Hoddan had to demonstrate. But shortly after, there were 20, 30, 50 of the folk from Colin feverishly searching the ship and incredulously reporting what they found. "It's impossible," said the old man. "It's impossible." "I wouldn't say that," said Hoddan. "It's unlikely, but it's happened. I'm only afraid it's not enough." "It is many times what we hoped," said the old man humbly. "Only," he stopped, "we are more grateful than we can say." Hoddan took a deep breath. "I'd like to take my crew back home," he explained, "and come back and, well, perhaps I can be useful explaining things, and I'd like to ask a great favor of you for my own work." "But naturally," said the old man. "Of course we will await your return, naturally, and perhaps we can arrange something." Hoddan was relieved. There did seem a slightly strange limitation to the happiness of the emigrants. They were passionately rejoiceful over the agricultural machinery, but they seemed rather dutifully than truly happy over the microfilm library. The vision tape instructors were the objects of polite comment only. Hoddan felt a vague discomfort. There seemed to be a sort of secret desperation in the atmosphere which they would not admit or mention. But he was coming back. Of course. He brought the boat over to the new liner. He hooked onto a lifeboat blister, and his 7 Darthians crawled through the lifeboat tube. Hoddan pulled away quickly before somebody thought to ask why there were no lifeboats in the places so plainly made for them. He headed downward when the landmarks on Darth's surface told him that Don Loris Castle would shortly come over the horizon. He was just touching atmosphere when it did. The boat's rocket tanks had been refilled, and he burned fuel recklessly to make a dramatic landing within 100 yards of the battlements where Fanny had once thoughtfully had a coil of rope ready for him. Heads peered at the lifeboat over those same battlements now, but the gate was closed. It stayed closed. There was somehow an atmosphere of suspicion amounting to enmity. Hoddan felt unwelcome. "All right, boys," he said resignedly. "Out with you and to the Assel, you've got your loot from the voyage." He'd counted out for each of them rather more actual cash than any of them really believed in. "And I want you to take this box to Don Loris. It's a gift from me, and I want to consult with him about cooperation between the two of us in some plans I have. Ask if I may come and talk to him." His 7 former spearmen tumbled out. They marched gleefully to the castle gate. Hoddan saw them tantalizingly displaying large sums in cash to the watchers above them. Thal held up the box for Don Loris. It was the box the lawyer's clerk had turned over to him with a tidy sum in cash in it. The sum was partly depleted now. Hoddan had paid off his involuntary crew with it, had paid them, in fact, as if they'd done the fighting they'd expected and he'd thought would be necessary. But there was still more. In it than Don Loris would have gotten from Walden for selling him out. The castle gate opened as if grudgingly. The 7 went in. With the box, time passed. Much time. Hoddan went over the arguments he meant to use on Don Loris. He needed to make up a very great sum, and it could be done thus and so, but thus and so required occasional piratical raids, which called for pirate crews, and if Don Loris would encourage his retainers, he could have gone to another Darthian chieftain, of course, but he knew what kind of scoundrel Don Loris was. He'd have to find out about another man. Nearly an hour elapsed before the castle gate opened again. 2 files of spearmen marched out. There were 8 men with a sergeant in command. Hoddan did not recognize any of them. They came to the spaceboat. The sergeant formally presented an official message. Don Loris would admit Bron Hoddan to his presence to hear what he had to say. Hoddan felt excessively uncomfortable. Waiting, he'd thought about that secret despair in the emigrant fleet. He worried about it. He was concerned because Don Loris had not welcomed him with cordiality, now that he'd brought back his retainers in good working order. In a sudden, gloomy premonition, he checked his stun pistols. They needed charging. He managed it from the lifeboat unit. He went forebodingly toward the castle with the 8 spearmen surrounding him as cops had once surrounded him on Walden. He did not like to be reminded of it. He frowned to himself as he went in the castle gate and along a long stone passage and up stone stairs into the great hall of state. Don Loris, as once before, sat peevishly by the huge fireplace. This time he was almost inside it, with its hood and mantle actually over his head. The Lady Fanny sat there with him. Don Loris seemed to put aside his peevishness only a little to greet Hoddan. "My dear fellow," he said complainingly, "I don't like to welcome you with reproaches, but you know that when you absconded with that spaceboat, you made a mortal enemy for me. It's a fact. My neighbor, on whose land the boat descended, was deeply hurt. He considered it his property. He had summoned his retainers for a fight over it when I heard of his resentment, and partly soothed him with apologies and presents. But he still considers that I should return it to him whenever you appear here with it." "Oh," said Hoddan, "that's too bad." Things looked ominous. The Lady Fanny looked at him strangely, as if she tried to tell him something without speaking it. She looked as if she had wept lately. "To be sure," said Don Loris. "Fretfully, you gave me a very pretty present just now, but my retainers tell me that you came back with a ship, a very fine ship. What became of it? The landing grid has been repaired at last and you could have landed it. What happened to it?" "I gave it away," said Hoddan. He saw what Fanny was trying to tell him. 1 corridor, no 2, leading toward the great hall was filled with spearmen. His tone turned sardonic. "I gave it to a poor old man." Don Loris shook his head. "That's not right, Hoddan. That fleet overhead now. If they are pirates and want some of my men for crews, they should come to me. I don't take kindly to the idea of your kidnapping my men and carrying them off on piratical excursions. They must be profitable. But if you can afford to give me presents like that and be so lavish with my retainers, why, I don't see." "Why," Hoddan grimaced. "Came to arrange a deal on that order," he observed. "I don't think I like it," said Don Loris peevishly. "I prefer to deal with people direct. I'll arrange about the landing grid and for a regular recruiting service which I will conduct, of course. But you are irresponsible. I wish you well. When you carry my men off for pirates and make my neighbors into my enemies and infect my dog with strange notions, and the government of a friendly planet asks me in so many words not to shelter you any longer. Why, that's the end, Hoddan. So with great regret." "The regret is mine," said Hoddan. Thoughtfully, he aimed a stun pistol at a slowly opening door. He pulled the trigger. Yells followed its humming because not everybody it hit was knocked out, nor did it hit everybody in the corridor. Men came surging out of one door and then 2 to require the attention of his weapons. Then a spear went past Hoddan's face and missed him only by inches. It buried its point in the floor. A whirling knife spun past his nose. He glanced up. There were balconies all around the great hall, and men popped up from behind the railings and threw things at him. They popped down out of sight instantly. There was no rhythm involved. He could not anticipate their rising, nor shoot them through the balcony front. And more men infiltrated the hall, getting behind heavy chairs and tables to push toward him behind them as shovable shields. More spears and knives flew. "Bron," cried the Lady Fanny throatily. He thought she had an exit for him. He sprang to her side. I I didn't want you to come, she wept. There was a singular pause in the clangings and clashings of weapons on the floor. For a second, noises continued. Then they stopped. Then one man popped up and hurled a knife. The clang of its fall was a very lonely one. Don Loris fairly howled at him. Idiot, think of the Lady Fanny. The Lady Fanny suddenly smiled tremulously. Wonderful, she said. They don't dare do anything while you're as close to me as this, do you suppose? Asked Hoddan. I could count on that? I'm certain of it, said Fanny. And I think you'd better. Then, excuse me, said Hoddan with great politeness. He swung her up and over his shoulder. With a stun pistol in his free hand, he headed down the hall. Outside, she said zestfully. Get out the side door and turn left, and nobody can jump down on your neck. Then left again to the gate. He obeyed. Now and again he got in a potshot with his pistol. Don Loris had turned the castle into a very pretty trap. The Lady He said plaintively, This is terribly undignified, and I can't see where we're going. Where are we now? Almost at the gate, panted Hoddan. At it now. He swung out of the massive entrance to Don Loris' stronghold. I can put you down now. I wouldn't, said the Lady Fanny. In spite of the end of me that's uppermost, I think you'd better make for the space boat exactly as we are. Again, Hoddan obeyed, racing across the open ground. Howls of fury followed him. It was evidently the opinion of the castle that the Lady Fanny was to be abducted in the place of the 7 returned spearmen. Hoddan, breathing hard, reached the space boat. He put Fanny down and said anxiously, You're all right. I'm very much in your debt. I was in a spot. Then he nodded toward the castle. They are upset, aren't they? They must think I mean to kidnap you. The Lady Fanny beamed. It would be terrible. Well, if you did, she said hopefully. I couldn't do a thing to stop you, and a successful public abduction's a legal marriage on Darth. Wouldn't it be terrible? Hoddan mopped his face and patted her reassuringly on the shoulder. Don't worry, he said warmly. You just got me out of an awful fix. You're my friend, and anyhow I'm going to marry a girl on Walden named Nedda. Goodbye, Fanny. Keep clear of the rocket blast. He went into the boat port, turned to beam paternally back at her, and shut the port behind him. Seconds later, the space boat took off. It left behind clouds of rocket smoke, and though Hoddan hadn't the faintest idea of it, it left behind the maddest girl in several solar systems. It is the custom of all men, everywhere, to be obtuse where women are concerned. Hoddan went skyward in the spaceboat with feelings of warm gratitude toward the Lady Fanny. He had not the slightest inkling that she, who had twice spoiled her father's skullduggery so far as it affected him, felt any but the friendliest of feelings toward him. He remembered that he had kept her from the necessity of adjusting to matrimony with the Lord Gek. It did not occur to him that most girls intend to adjust to marriage with somebody anyhow, and he did not even suspect that it is a feminine instinct. To make a highly dramatic and romantic production of their marriage so they'll have something to be sentimental about in later years. As Hoddan drove on up and up, the sky became deep purple, and then black velvet set with flecks of fire. He was relieved by the welcome he'd received earlier today from the emigrants, but he remained slightly puzzled by a very faint impression of desperation remaining. He felt very virtuous on the whole. However, and his plans for the future were specific. He'd already composed a letter to his grandfather, which he'd asked the emigrant fleet to deliver. He had another letter in his mind, a form letter, practically a public relations circular, which he hoped to whip into shape before the emigrants got too anxious to be on their way. He considered that he needed to earn a little more of their gratitude so he could make everything come out even. Self-liquidated, everybody satisfied and happy but himself. For himself, he anticipated only the deep satisfaction of accomplishment. He'd wanted to do great things since he was a small boy, and in electronics since his adolescence, when he'd found textbooks in the libraries of looted spaceships. He'd gone to Walden in the hope of achievement. There, of course, he failed because in a free economy industrialists consider that free. Idem is the privilege to be stupid without penalty. In other than free economies, of course, stupidity is held to be the duty of administrators. But Hoddan now believed himself in the fascinating situation of having knowledge and abilities which were needed by people who knew their need. It was only when he'd made contact with the fleet, and was in the act of maneuvering toward a boat blister on the liner he'd brought back, that doubts again assailed him. He had done a few things, accomplished a little. He'd devised a broadcast power receptor and a microwave projector, and he'd turned a Lawler drive into a ball lightning projector and worked out a few little things like that. But the first had been invented before by somebody in the SETI's cluster, and the second could have been made by anybody, and the third was standard practice on Zan. He still had to do something significant. When he made fast to the liner and crawled through the boat tube to its hull, he was in a state of doubt which passed very well for modesty. The bearded old man received him in the skipper's quarters, which Hoddan himself had occupied for a few days. He looked very weary. He seemed to have aged in hours. "We grow more astounded by the minute," he told Hoddan heavily, "by what you have brought us. 10 shiploads like this and we would be better equipped than we believed ourselves in the beginning. It looks as if some thousands of us will now be able to survive our colonization of the planet Thetis." Hoddan gaped at him. The old man put his hand on Hoddan's shoulder. "We are grateful," he said with a pathetic attempt at warmth. "Please do not doubt that. It is only that you had to accept what was given for our use, but I cannot help wishing very desperately that instead of unfamiliar tools for metal working and machines with tapes which show pictures, I wish that even one more jungle plow had been included." Hoddan's jaw dropped. The people of Colin wanted planet-subduing machinery. They wanted it so badly that they did not want anything else. They could not even see that anything else had any value at all. Most of them could only look forward to starvation when the ship supplies were exhausted, because not enough ground could be broken and cultivated early enough to grow food enough in time. "Would it," asked the old man desperately, "be possible to exchange these useless machines for others that will be useful?" Let me talk to your mechanics, sir," said Hoddan unhappily. "Maybe something can be done." He restrained himself from tearing his hair as he went to where mechanics of the fleet looked over their treasure trove. He'd come up to the fleet again to gloat and do great things for people who needed him and knew it. But he faced the hopelessness of people to whom his utmost effort seemed mockery because it was so far from being enough. He gathered together the men who'd tried to keep the fleet's ships in working order during their flight. They were competent men, of course. They were resolute. But now they had given up hope. And began to lecture them. They needed machines. He hadn't brought the machines they wanted, perhaps, but he'd brought the machines to make them with. Here were automatic shapers, turret lathes, dicers. Here were cutting points for machines these machines could make to make the machines the colony on Thetis would require. He'd brought these because they had the raw material. They had their ships themselves. Even some of the junk they carried in crates was good. Metal, merely worn out in its present form. They could make anything they needed with what he'd brought them. For example, he'd show them how to make, say, a lumber saw. He showed them how to make a lumber saw, slender, rapier-like revolving tool with which a man stabbed a tree and cut outward with the speed of a knife cutting hot butter. And one could mount it so, and cut out planks and beams for temporary bridges and such constructions. They watched, baffled. They gave no sign of hope. They did not want lumber saws. They wanted jungle-breaking machinery. "I've brought you everything," he insisted. "You've got a civilization compact on this ship. You've got life instead of starvation. Look at this. I make a water pump to irrigate your fields." Before their eyes, he turned out an irrigation pump on an automatic shaper. He showed them that the shaper went on by itself, making other pumps without further instructions than the by-hand control of the tools that formed the first. The mechanics stirred uneasily. They had watched without comprehension. Now they listened without enthusiasm. Their eyes were like those of children who watch marvels without comprehension. He made a sledge whose runners slid on air between themselves and whatever object would otherwise have touched them. It was practically frictionless. He made a machine to make nails, utterly simple. He made a power hammer which hummed and pushed nails into any object that needed to be nailed. He stopped abruptly and sat down with his head in his hands. The people of the fleet faced so overwhelming a catastrophe that they could not see into it. They could only experience it. As their leader would have been unable to answer questions about the fleet's predicament before he'd poured out the tale in the form it had taken in his mind, now these mechanics were unable to see ahead. They were paralyzed by the completeness of the disaster before them. They could live until the supplies of the fleet gave out. They could not grow fresh supplies without jungle-breaking machinery. They had to have jungle-breaking machinery. They could not imagine wanting anything less than jungle-breaking machinery. Hoddan raised his head. The mechanic looked dully at him. "You men do maintenance?" he asked. "You repair things when they wear out on the ships. Have you run out of some materials you need for repairs?" After a long time, a tired-looking man said slowly, "On the ship I come from, we're having trouble. Our hydroponic garden keeps the air fresh, of course, but the water circulation pipes are gone. Rusted through, we haven't got any pipe to fix them with, we have to keep the water moving with buckets." Hoddan got up. He looked about him. He hadn't brought hydroponic garden pipe supplies, and there was no raw material. He took a pair of power snips and cut away a section of cargo space wall lining. He cut it into strips. He asked the diameter of the pipe. Before their eyes he made pipe, spirally wound around a mandrel and line welded to solidity. "I need some of that on my ship," said another man. And the bearded man said heavily, "We'll make some and send it to the ships that need it." "No," said Hoddan. "We'll send the tools to make it. We can make the tools here. There must be other kinds of repairs that can't be made. With the machines I've brought, we'll make the tools to make the repairs. Picture tape machines have reels that show exactly how to do it." It was a new idea. The mechanics had other and immediate problems beside the overall disaster of the fleet, pumps that did not work, motors that heated up. They could envision the meeting of those problems, and they could envision the obtaining of jungle plows, but they could not imagine anything in between. They were capable of learning how to make tools for repairs. Hoddan taught them. In one day, there were 5 ships being brought into better operating condition for ultimate futility because of what he'd brought. 2 days. Mechanics began to come to the liner. Those who'd learned first pompously passed on what they knew. On the 4th day, somebody began to use a vision tape machine to get information on a fine point in welding. On the 5th day, there were lines of men waiting to use them. On the 6th day, a mechanic on what had been a luxury passenger liner on the other side of the galaxy. But it was scores of years ago, asked to talk to Hoddan by spacephone. He'd been working feverishly at the minor repairs he'd been unable to make for so long. To get material, he pulled a crate off one of the junk machines supplied the fleet. He looked it over. He believed that if this piece were made new and that replaced with sound metal, the machine might be usable. Hoddan had him come to the liner, which was now the flagship of the fleet. Discussion began. Shaping such large pieces of metal which could be taken from here or there, shaping such large pieces of metal. Hoddan began to draw diagrams. They were not clear. He drew more. Abruptly, he stared at what he'd outlined. Electronics? He saw something remarkable. If one applied a perfectly well-known bit of pure science information that nobody bothered with, he finished the diagram, and a vast, soothing satisfaction came over him. "We've got to get out of here," he said. "Not enough room?" He looked about him. Insensibly, as he talked to the first man on the fleet to show imagination, other men had gathered around. They were now absorbed. "I think," said Hoddan, "that we can make an electronic field that'll soften the cementite between the crystals of steel without heating up anything else. If it works, we can make die forgings and die stampings with plastic dies. And then that useless junk you've got can be rebuilt." They listened gravely, nodding as he talked. They did not quite understand everything, but they had the habit of believing him now. He needed this and that in the huge cargo spaces of the ship the leader had formerly used. Said Hoddan. "How about duplicating these machines and sending them over?" They looked estimatingly at the toolshop equipment. It could be made to duplicate itself, the new machine. Shop in the ancient arc of space made another machine shop for another ship. In the other ship, that tool shop would make another for another ship, which in turn. By then, Hoddan had a cold metal die stamper in operation. It was very large. It drew on the big ship's drive unit for power. One put a rough mass of steel in place between plastic dies. One turned on the power. For the 10th of a second, no longer, the steel was soft as putty. Then it stiffened and was warm. But in that 10th of a second, it had been shaped with precision. It took 2 days to duplicate the jungle plow Hoddan had first been shown, in new sound metal. But after the first one worked triumphantly, They made 40 of each part at a time and turned out jungle plow equipment enough for the subjugation of all Thetty's forests. There were other enterprises on hand, of course. A mechanic who uttered horribly had an idea. He could not explain it or diagram it, so he made it. It was an electric motor very far ahead of those in the machines of Colin. Hoddan waked from a cat nap with a diagram in his head. He drew it, half asleep, and later looked and found that his unconscious mind had designed a power supply system which made Walden's look rather primitive. During the first 6 days, Hoddan did not sleep to speak. Of and after that, he merely catnapped when he could. But he finally agreed with the emigrants' leader, now no longer fierce but fiercely triumphant, that he thought they could go on, and he would ask a favor. He propped his eyelids open with his fingers and wrote the letter to his grandfather that he'd composed in his mind in the liner on Krim. He managed to make 1 copy, unaddressed, of the public relations letter that he'd worked out at the SE. In time, he put it through a facsimile machine and managed to address each of 50 copies. Then he yawned uncontrollably. He still yawned when he went to take leave of the leader of the people of Colin. That person regarded him with warm eyes. "I think everything's all right," said Hoddan exhaustedly. "You've got a dozen machine shops and they are multiplying themselves, and you have got some enthusiastic mechanics now who are drinking in a vision tape stuff and finding out more than they guessed there was, and they're thinking now and then for themselves. I think you'll make out." The bearded man said humbly, "I have waited until you said all was well. Will you come with us?" "No, said Hoddan. He yawned again. "I've got my work here. There's an obligation I have to meet." "It must be very admirable work," said the old man wistfully. "I wish we had some young men laugh." "Ick you among us?" "You have," said Hoddan. "They will be giving you trouble presently." The old man shook his head, looking at Hoddan very affectionately indeed. "We will deliver your letters," he said warmly. "First to Krim and then to Walden. Then we will go on and let down your letter and gift to your grandfather on Zan. Then we will go on toward Thetty's. Our mechanics will work at building machines while we are in overdrive. But so they will build new tool shops and train new mechanics, so that every so often we will need to come out of overdrive to transfer the tools and the men to new ships." Hoddan nodded exhaustedly. This was right. "So," said the old man contentedly, "we will simply make those transfers in orbit about the planets for which we have your letters. But you will pardon us if we only let down your letters and do not visit those planets. So we have prejudices, perfectly satisfactory," said Hoddan. "So the mechanics you have trained," said the old man proudly, "have made a little ship ready for you. It is not much larger than your spaceboat, but it is fit for travel between suns, which will be convenient for your work. I hope you will accept it. There is even a tiny tool shop on it." Hoddan would have been more touched if he hadn't known about it. But one of the men entrusted with the job had harassedly asked him for advice. He knew what he was getting. It was the space yacht he'd used before, refurbished and fitted with everything the emigrants could provide. He affected great surprise and expressed unfeigned appreciation. Barely an hour later, he transferred to it with the spaceboat in tow. He watched the emigrant fleet swing out to emptiness and resume its valiant journey. But it was not a hopeless journey now. In fact, the colony on Thetys ought to start out better equipped than most settled planets, and he went to sleep. He'd nothing urgent to do except allow a certain amount of time to pass before he did anything. He was exhausted. He slept the clock around and waked and ate sluggishly and went back to sleep again. On the whole, the cosmos did not notice the difference. Stars flamed in emptiness and planets rotated sedately on their axes. Comets flung out gossamer veils or retracted them, and space liners went about upon their lawful occasions. And lovers swore by stars and moons, often quite different stars and moons, and various things happened which had nothing to do with Hoddan. But when he waked again, he was rested, and he reviewed all his actions and his situation. It appeared that matters promised fairly well on the emigrant fleet now gone forever. They would remember Hoddan with affection for a year or so, and dimly after that. But settling a new world would be enthralling and important work. Nobody'd think of him at all after a certain length of time. But he had to think of an obligation he'd assumed on their account. He considered his own affairs. He'd told Fanny he was going to marry Nedda. The way things looked, that was no longer so probable. Of course, In a year or two or a few years, he might be out from under the obligations he now considered due. In time, even the Waldenian government would realize that death rays don't exist, and a lawyer might be able to clear things for his return to Walden. But Nedda was a nice girl, he frowned. That was it. She was a remarkably nice girl, but Hoddan suddenly doubted if she were a delightful one. He found himself questioning that she was exactly and perfectly what his long-cherished ambitions described. He tried to imagine spending his declining years with Nedda. He couldn't quite picture it as exciting. She did tend to be a little insipid, presently gloomy and a trifle dogged about it. He brought the spaceboat around to the modernized boatport of the yacht. He got into it, leaving the yacht in orbit. He headed down toward Darth. Now that he'd rested, he had work to do which could not be neglected. To carry out that work, he needed a crew able and willing to pass for pirates for a pirate's pay. And there were innumerable castles on Darth, with quite as many shifty noblemen, and certainly no fewer plunder-hungry Darthian gentlemen hanging around them. But Don Loris Castle had one real advantage, and one which existed only in Hoddan's mind. Don Loris retainers did not. But that Hoddan had led their companions to loot. Large loot. He'd have less trouble and more enthusiastic support from Don Loris retainers than any other. This was true. The illusion was that the Lady Fanny was his firm personal friend with no nonsense about her. This was a very great mistake. He landed for the 4th time outside Don Loris Castle. This time he had no booty-laden men to march to the castle and act as heralds of his presence. The spaceboat's vision screen showed Don Loris' stronghold as immense, dark, and menacing. Banners flew from its turrets, their colors bright in the ruddy light of near sunset. The gate remained closed. For a long time there was no sign that his landing had been noted. Then there was movement on the battlements, and a figure began to descend outside the wall. It was lowered to the ground by a long rope. It reached the ground and shook itself. It marched toward the spaceboat through the red and nearly level rays of the dying sun. Hoddan watched with a frown on his face. This wasn't a retainer of Don Loris. It assuredly wasn't Fanny. He couldn't even make out its gender until the figure was very near. Then he looked astonished. It was his old friend Derec, arrived on Darth a long while since in the spaceboat Hoddan had been using ever since. Derec had been his boon companion in the days when he expected to become rich by splendid exploits in electronics. Derec was also the character who'd conscientiously told the cops on Hoddan when they found his power receptor sneaked into a mid-continent station and a stray corpse coincidentally outside. He opened the boat port and stood in the opening. Derec had been a guest, anyhow an inhabitant, of Don Loris Castle for a good long while now. Hoddan wondered if he considered his quarters cozy. "Evening, Derec," said Hoddan cordially. "You're looking well." "I don't feel it," said Derec dismally. "I feel like a fool in the castle yonder, and the high police official I came here with has gotten grumpy and snaps when I try to speak to him." Hoddan said gravely, "I'm sure the Lady Fanny, a tigress," said Derec bitterly. "We don't get along." Looking at Derec, Hoddan found himself able to understand why. Derec was the sort of friend one might make on Walden for lack of something better. He was well-meaning. He might be capable of splendid things, even heroism. But he was horribly, terribly, appallingly civilized. Well, said Hoddan kindly. "And what's on your mind, Derec?" "I came," said Derec dismally, "to plead with you again, Bron. You must surrender. There's nothing else to do. People can't have death rays, brah. And above all, you mustn't tell the pirates how to make them." Hoddan was puzzled for a moment. Then he realized that Derek's information about the fleet came from the spearmen he'd brought back, loaded down with cash. Derec hadn't noticed the absence of the flashing lights at sunset, or hadn't realized that they meant the fleet was gone away. "HMMM," said Hoddan. "Why don't you think I've already done it?" "Because they'd have killed you." Derec, Don Loris pointed that out. "He doesn't believe you know how to make death rays. He says it's not a secret anybody would be willing for anybody else to know. But you know the truth, Bron. You killed that poor man back on Walden. You've got to sacrifice yourself for humanity. You'll be treated kindly." Hoddan shook his head. It seemed somehow very startling for Derec to be harping on that same idea after so many things had happened to Hoddan, but he didn't think Derec would actually expect him to yield to persuasion. There must be something else. Derec might even have nerved himself up to something quite desperate. "What did you really come here for, Derec?" "To beg you to." And in one instant, Derec made an hysterical gesture and Hoddan's stun pistol hummed. A small object left Derek's hand as his muscles convulsed from the stun pista. Bolt, it did not fly quite true. It fell a foot or so to one side of the boat port instead of inside. It exploded luridly as Derec crumpled from the pistol bolt. There was thick, strangling smoke. Hoddan disappeared. When the thickest smoke drifted away, there was nothing to be seen but Derec, lying on the ground, and thinner smoke drifting out of the still-open boat port. Nearly half an hour later, figures came very cautiously toward the spaceboat. Thal was their leader. His expression was mournful and depressed. Other brawny retainers came uncertainly behind him. At a nod from Thal, two of them picked up Derec and carted him off toward the castle. "I guess he got it," said Thal dismally. He peered in. He shook his head. "Wounded, maybe, and crawled off to die." He peered in again and shook his head once more. No sign of him. A spearman just behind Thal said, "Der. De trick, I was with him to Walden, and he paid off good. A good man, should have been a chieftain." "Good man." Thal entered the spaceboat, gingerly. He wrinkled his nose at the faint smell of explosives still inside. Another man came in. Another. "Say," said one of them in a conspiratorial voice. "We got our share of that loot from Walden, but he had a share too. What he do with it? He could have kept it in this boat here. We could take a... Ick, look, what Don Loris don't know don't hurt him." "I'm going to find Hoddan first," said Thal with dignity. "We don't have to carry him outside so's Don Loris knows we're looking for loot, but I'm going to find him first." There were other men in the spaceboat now, a full dozen of them. Their spears were very much in the way. The boat door closed quietly. Don Loris retainers stared at each other. The locking dogs grumbled. Or half a second, sealing the door tightly. Don Loris retainers began to babble protestingly. There was a roaring outside. The spaceboat stirred. The roaring rose to thunder. The boat lurched. It flung the spearmen into a sprawling, swearing, terrified heap at the rear end of the boat's interior. The boat went on out to space again. In the control room, Hoddan said dourly to himself, "I'm in a rut. I've got to figure out some way to ship a Pyra crew without having to kidnap them. This is getting monotonous." There was a disturbing air which was shared by all the members of Hoddan's crew on the way to Walden. It was not exactly reluctance, because there was self-evident enthusiasm over the idea of making a pirate voyage under him. So far as past enterprises were concerned, Hoddan as a leader was the answer to a Darthian gentleman's prayer. The partial looting of Gex Castle, alone, would have made him a desirable leader. But a crew of 7, returned from space, had displayed currency which amounted to the wealth of fabled Ind. Nobody knew what Ind was any longer, but it was a synonym for fabulous and uncountable riches. When men went off with Hoddan, they came back rich. But nevertheless, there was an uncomfortable sort of atmosphere in the renovated yacht. They'd transshipped from the spaceboat to the yacht through lifeboat tubes, and they were quite docile about it because none of them knew how to get back to ground. Hoddan left the spaceboat with a triggerable timing signal set for use on his return. He'd done a similar thing off Krim. He drove the little yacht well out, until Darth was only a spotted ball with visible clouds and ice caps. Then he lined up for Walden, direct, and went into overdrive. Within hours, he noted the disturbing feel of things. His followers were not happy. They moped. They sat in corners and submerged themselves in misery. Large, massive men with drooping blonde mustaches, ideal characters for the roles of pirates, tended to squeeze tears out of their eyes at odd moments. When the ship was 12 hours on its way, the atmosphere inside it was funereal. The spearmen did not even gorge themselves on the food with which the yacht was stocked. And when a Darthian gentleman lost his appetite, something had to be wrong. He called Thal into the control room. "What's the matter with the gang?" he demanded vexedly. "They look at me as if I'd broken all their hearts. Do they want to go back?" Thal heaved a sigh, indicating depression beside which suicidal mania would be hilarity. He said pathetically, "We cannot go back. We cannot ever return to Darth. We are lost men, doomed to wander forever among strangers or to float as corpses between the stars." "What happened?" demanded Hoddan. "I'm taking you on a pirate cruise where the loot should be a lot better than last time." Thal wept. Hoddan astonishedly regarded his whiskery countenance, contorted with grief and dampened with tears. "It happened at the castle," said Thal miserably. "The man Derec from Walden had thrown a bomb at you. You seemed to be dead, but Don Loris was not sure. He fretted, as he does. He wished to send someone to make sure. The Lady Fanny said, "I will make sure." She called me to her and said, "Thal, will you fight for me?" And there was Don Loris suddenly nodding beside her. So I said, "Yes, my Lady Fanny." Then she said, "Thank you. I am troubled by Bron Hoddan, so what could I do?" She said the same thing to each of us, and each of us had to say that he would fight for her. To each she said that she was troubled by you. Then Don Loris sent us out to look at your body, and now we are disgraced. Hoddan's mouth opened and closed and opened again. He remembered this item of Darthian etiquette. If a girl asked a man if he would fight for her and he agreed, then within a day and a night he had to fight the man she sent him to fight, or else he was disgraced. And disgrace on Darth meant that the shamed man could be plundered or killed by anybody who chose to do so, but he would be hanged by indignant authority if he resisted. It was a great deal worse than outlawry. It included scorn and contempt and opprobrium. It meant dishonor and humiliation and admitted degradation. A disgraced man was despicable in his own eyes. And Hoddan had kidnapped these men who'd been forced to engage themselves to fight him, and if they killed him, they would obviously die in space, and if they didn't, they'd be ashamed to stay alive. The moral tone on Darth was probably not elevated, but etiquette was a force. Hoddan thought it over. He looked up suddenly. "Some of them," he said wryly, "probably figure there's nothing to do but go through with it, eh?" "Yes," said Thal dismally. "Then we will all die." "HMMM," said Hoddan. "The obligation is to fight. If you fail to kill me, that's not your fault, is it? If you're conquered, you're in the clear?" Thal said miserably. "True. Too true. When a man is conquered, he is conquered. His conqueror may plunder him when the matter is finished, or he can spare him when he may never fight his conqueror again." "Draw your knife," said Hoddan. "Come at me." Thal bewilderedly made the gesture. Hoddan leveled a stun pistol and said, "Bzzz, you're conquered. You came at me with your knife, and I shot you with my stun pistol. It's all over. Right?" Thal gaped at him. Then he beamed, he expanded, he gloated, he frisked. He practically wagged a non-existent tail in his exuberance. He'd been shonen out when he could see none. "Send in the others one by one," said Hoddan. "I'll take care of them. But Thal, why did the Lady Fanny want me killed?" Thal had no idea, but he did not care. Hoddan did care. He was bewildered and inclined to be indignant. A noble friendship like theirs, a spearman, came in and saluted. Hoddan went through a symbolic duel, which was plainly the way the thing would have happened in reality. Others came in and went through the same process. Two of them did not quite grasp that it was a ritual, and he had to shoot them in the knife arm. Then he hunted in the ship's supplies for ointment for the blisters that would appear from stun pistol bolts at such short range. As he bandaged the places, he again tried to find out why the Lady Fanny had tried to get him carved up by the large-bladed knives all Darthian gentlemen wore. Nobody could enlighten him, but the atmosphere improved remarkably. Since each theoretic fight had taken place in private, nobody was obliged to admit a compromise with etiquette. Hoddan's followers ceased to brood. They developed huge appetites. Those who had been aground on Krim told zestfully of the monstrous hangovers they'd acquired there. It appeared that Hoddan was revered for the size of the benders he enabled his followers to hang on, but there remained the fact that the Lady Fanny had tried to get him massacred. He puzzled over it. The little yacht sped through space toward Walden. He tried to think how he'd offended Fanny. He could think of nothing. He set to work on a new electronic setup, which would make still another modification of the Lawler space drive possible. In the others, groups of electronic components were cut out, and others substituted in rather tricky fashion from the control board. This was trickiest of all. It required the homemade vacuum tube to burn steadily when in use. But it was a very simple idea. Lawler drive and landing grid force fields were formed by not dissimilar generators, and ball lightning force fields were in the same general family of phenomena. Suppose one made the field generator that had to be on a ship if it was to drive at all, capable of all those allied, associated similar force fields. If a ship could make the fields that landing grids did, it should be useful to pirates. Hoddan's present errand was neither pure nor simple piracy, but piracy it would be. The more he considered the obligation he'd taken on himself when he helped the emigrant fleet, the more he doubted that he could lift it without long struggle. He was preparing to carry on that struggle for a long time. He'd more or less resigned himself to the postponement of his personal desires. Nedda, for example. He wasn't quite sure, perhaps, after all, but time passed, and he finished his electronic job. He came out of overdrive and made his observations and corrected his course. Finally, there came a moment when the fiery ball which was Walden's sun shone brightly in the vision plates. It writhed and spun in the vast silence of emptiness. Hoddan drove to a point still above the 5-diameter limit of Walden. He interestedly switched on the control which made his drive unit manufacture landing grid-type force fields. He groped for Walden and felt the peculiar rigidity of the ship when the field took hold somewhere underground. He made an adjustment and felt the ship respond. Instead of pulling a ship to ground in the setup he'd made, the new fields pulled the ground toward the ship. When he reversed the adjustment, instead of pushing the ship away to empty space, the new field pushed the planet. There was no practical difference, of course. The effect was simply that the space yacht carried its own landing grid. It could descend anywhere and ascend from anywhere without using rockets. Moreover, it could hover without using power. Hoddan was pleased. He took the yacht down to a bare 400-mile altitude. He stopped it there. It was highly satisfactory. He made quite certain that everything worked as it should. Then he made a call on the space communicator. "Calling ground," said Hoddan. "Calling ground, pirate." "Ship calling ground?" He waited for an answer. Now he'd find out the result of very much effort and planning. He was apprehensive, of course. There was much responsibility on his shoulders. There was the liner he'd captured and looted and given to the emigrants. There were his followers on the yacht, now enthusiastically sharpening their 2-foot knife blades in expectation of loot. He owed these people something. For an instant he thought of the lady, Fanny, and wondered how he could make reparation to her for whatever had hurt her feelings so she'd try to get his throat cut. A whining, bitterly unhappy voice came to him. "Pirate ship," said the voice plaintively. "We received the fleet's warning. Please state where you intend to descend, and we will take measures to prevent disorder." "Repeat, please state where you intend to descend, and we will take measures to prevent disorder." Hoddan drew a sharp breath of relief. He named a spot, a high-income residential small city some 40 miles from the planetary capital. He set his controls for a very gradual descent. He went out to where his followers made grisly zinging noises where they honed their knives. "We'll land," said Hoddan sternly. "In about 3/4 of an hour. You will go ashore and loot in parties of not less than 3. Thal, you will be ship guard and eve the plunder and make sure that nobody from Walden gets on board. You will not waste time committing atrocities on the population." He went back to the control room. He turned to general communication bands and listened to the broadcasts down below. "Special emergency bulletin," boomed a voice. "Pirates are landing in the city of Ensfield, 40 miles from Walden City. The population is instructed to evacuate immediately, leaving all action to the police. Repeat, the population will evacuate Ensfield, leaving all action to the police. Take nothing with you, leave at once." Hoddan nodded approvingly. The voice boomed again. "Special emergency bulletin. Pirates are landing. Evacuate, take nothing with you, leave at once." He turned to another channel. An excited voice barked. "Seems to be only the one pirate ship, which has been located hovering in an unknown manner over Ensfield. We are rushing camera crews to the spot, and will try to give on the spot as it happens coverage of the landing of pirates on Walden, their looting of the city of Ensfield, and the traffic jams inevitable in the departure of the citizens before the pirate ship touches ground. For background information on this, the most exciting event in planetary history, I take you to our editorial rooms." Another voice took over instantly. "It will be remembered that some days since the gigantic pirate fleet then overhead sent down a communication to the planetary government, warning that single ships would appear to loot and giving notice that any resistance." Hoddan felt a contented, heartwarming glow. The emigrant fleet had most faithfully carried out its leader's promise to let down a letter from space while in orbit around Walden. The emigrants, of course, did not know the contents of the letter. They would not send anybody down to ground, because of the temptations to sin in societies other than their own. Blithely and cheerfully and dutifully, they would give the appearance of monstrous piratical strength. They would awe Walden thoroughly. And then they'd go on, faithfully leaving similar letters and similar impressions on Krim and Lohala and Trally, and Famagusta, and throughout the Coalsack stars, until the stock of addressed missives ran out. They would perform this kindly act out of gratitude to Hoddan. and every planet they visited would be left with the impression that the fleet overhead was that of bloodthirsty space marauders who would presently send single ships to collect loot, which must be yielded without resistance. Such looting expeditions were to be looked for regularly and must be admitted to under penalty of unthinkable retribution from the monster fleet of space. Now, as the yacht descended on Walden, it represented that mythical but impressive piratical empire of Hoddan's contrivance. He listened with genuine pleasure to the broadcasts. When low enough, he even picked up the pictures of highways thronged with fugitives from the to-be-looted town. He saw Waldenian police directing the traffic of flight. He saw the traffic heading toward the city. Walden was the most highly civilized planet in the Nurmi cluster, and its citizens had had no worries at all except about tranquilizers to enable them to stand it. When something genuinely exciting turned up, they wanted to be there to see it. The yacht descended below the clouds. Hoddan turned on an emergency flare to make a landing by. Sitting in the control room, he saw his own ship as the broadcast cameras picked it up and relayed it to millions of homes. He was impressed. It was a glaring eye of fierce light, descending deliberately with a dark and mysterious spacecraft behind it. He heard the chattered on-the-spot news accounts of the happening. He saw the people who had not left Ensfield joined by avid visitors. He saw all of them held back by police, who frantically shepherded them away from the area in which the pirates should begin. In their horrid work, Hoddan even watched pleasurably from his control room as the broadcast cameras daringly showed the actual touchdown of the ship, the dramatic slow opening of its entrance port, the appearance of authentic pirates in the opening, armed to the teeth, bristling ferociously, glaring about them at the here silent, here deserted streets of the city left to their mercy. It was a splendid broadcast. Hoddan would have liked to stay and watch all of it, but he had work to do. He had to supervise the pirate raid. It was, as it turned out, simple enough. Looting parties of 3 pirates each moved skulking about, seeking plunder. Quaking cameramen dared to ask them in shaking voices to pose for the news cameras. It was a request no Darthian gentleman, even in an act of piracy, could possibly refuse. They posed, making pictures of malignant ruffianism. Commentators, adding informed comment to delectably thrilling pictures, observed that the pirates wore Darthian costume, but observed crisply that this did not mean that Darth as an entity had turned pirate, but only that some of her citizens had joined the pirate fleet. The camera crews then asked apologetically if they would permit themselves to be broadcast in the act of looting. Growling savagely for their public, and occasionally adding even a fiendish ha, they obliged. The camera crews helped pick out good places to loot for the sake of good pictures. The pirates cooperated in fine dramatic style. Millions watching vision sets all over the planet shivered in delicious horror as the pirates went about their nefarious enterprise. Presently, the press of onlookers could not be held back by the police. They surrounded the pirates. Some, greatly daring, asked for autographs. Girls watched them with round, frightened, fascinated eyes. Younger men found it vastly thrilling to carry burdens of loot back to the pirate ship for them. Thal complained hoarsely that the ship was getting overloaded. Hoddan ordered greater discrimination, but his pirates by this time were in the position of directors rather than looters themselves. Romantic Waldenian admirers smashed windows and brought them treasure, for the reward of a scowling accepta. Hoddan had to call it off. The pirate ship was loaded. It was then the center of an agitated, excited, enthusiastic crowd. He called back his men. 1 party of 3 did not return. He took 2 others and fought his way through the mob. He found the trio backed against a wall while hysterically adoring girls struggled to seize scraps of their garments for mementos of real, live pirates looting a Waldenian town. But Hodda got them back to the ship, in confusion tending toward the blushful. Their clothes were shreds. He fought a way clear for them to get into the ship. He fought his way in. Cheers rose from the onlookers. He got the landing port shut only by the help of police who kept pirate fans from having their fingers caught in its closing. Then the piratical space yacht rose swiftly toward the stars. An hour later, there was barely any diminution of the excitement inside the ship. Darthian gentlemen, all Hoddan's followers, still gazed and floated over the plunder tucked everywhere, It crowded the living quarters. It threatened to interfere with the astrogation of the ship. Hoddan came out of the control room and was annoyed. "Break it up," he snapped. "Pack that stuff away somewhere. What do you think this is?" Thal gazed at him abstractedly, not quite able to tear his mind and thoughts from this completely unimaginable mass of plunder. Then intelligence came into his eyes as much as could appear there. He grinned suddenly. He slapped his thigh. "Boys," he gurgled. "He don't know what we got for him." One man looked up. Two, they beamed. They got to their feet, dripping jewelry. Thal went ponderously to one of the two owners' staterooms the yacht contained. At the door he turned expansively. "She came to the port," he said exuberantly, "and said we were wearing clothes like they wore on Darth. Did we come from there? I said we did. Then she said did we know somebody named Bron Hoddan on Darth, and I said we did, and if she'd step inside the ship she'd meet you, and here she is." He unfastened the stateroom door, which had been barred from without. He opened it. He looked in and grabbed and pulled at something. Hoddan went sick with apprehension. He groaned as the something inside the stateroom sobbed and yielded. Thal brought Nedda out into the saloon of the yacht. Her nose and eyes were red from terrified weeping. She gazed about her in purest, despairing horror. She did not see Hoddan for a moment. Her eyes were filled with the brawny, mustachioed, piratical figures who were Darthian gentlemen and who grinned at her in what she took for evil gloating. She wailed. Hoddan swallowed, with much difficulty, and said sickly, "It's all right, Nedda. It was a mistake. Nothing will happen to you. You're quite," and he knew with desperate certainty that it was true, "safe with me." And she was. Hoddan stopped off at Crim by landing grid to consult his lawyers. He felt a certain amount of hope of good results from his raid on Walden, but he was desperate about Nedda. Once she was confident of her safety under his protection, she took over the operation of the spaceship. She displayed an overwhelming saccharinity that was appalling. She was sweetness and light among criminals who respectfully did not harm her, and she sweetened and lightened the atmosphere of the space yacht until Hoddan's followers were close to mutiny. "It ain't that I mind her being a nice girl," one of his mustachioed Darthians explained almost tearfully to Hoddan, "but she wants to make a nice girl out of me." Hoddan himself cringed from her society. He could gladly have put her ashore on Crim with ample funds to return to Walden. But she was prettily, reproachfully helpless. If he did put her ashore, she would confide her kidnapping and the lovely behavior of the pirates until nobody would believe in them anymore, which would be fatal. He went to his lawyers, brooding. The news astounded him. The emigrant fleet had appeared over him on the way to Walden. Before it appeared, Hoddan's affairs had been prosperous enough. Right after his previous visit, news had come of the daring piratical raid which captured a ship off Walden. This was the liner Hoddan brought into Crim. All merchants and ship owners immediately insured all vessels and goods in space transit at much higher valuations. The risk insurance stocks bought on Hoddan's account had multiplied in value. Obeying his instructions, his lawyers had sold them out and held a pleasing fortune in trust for Hoddan. Then came the fleet over Crim, with its letter threatening planetary destruction if resistance was offered to single ships which would land and loot later on. It seemed that all commerce was at the mercy of space marauders. Risk insurance companies had undertaken to indemnify the owners of ships and freight in emptiness. Now that an unprecedented pirate fleet ranged and doubtless ravaged the skyways, the insurance companies ought to go bankrupt. Owners of stock in them dumped it at any price to get rid of it. In accordance with Hoddan's instructions, though, his lawyers had faithfully, if distastefully, bought it in. To use up the funds available, they had to buy up not only all the stock of all the risk insurance companies of Crim, but all stock in all off-planet company owned by investors on Crim. Then time passed and ships in space arrived unmolested in port. Cargoes were delivered intact. Insurers observed that the risk insurance companies had not collapsed and could still pay off if necessary. They continued their insurance. Risk companies appeared financially sound once more. They had more business than ever and no more claims than usual. Suddenly their stocks went up, or rather what people were willing to pay for them went up, because Hoddan had forbidden the sale of any stock after the pirate fleet appeared. Now he asked hopefully if he could reimburse the owners of the ship he'd captured off Walden. He could. Could he pay them even the profit they'd have made between the loss of their ship and the arrival of a replacement? He could. Could he pay off the shippers of Rigelian furs and jewelry from the Seti's stars, and the owners of the bulk Melis? If that had brought so good a price on Crim, he could. In fact, he had. The insurance companies he now owned lock, stock, and barrel had already paid the claims on the ship and its cargo, and it would be rather officious to add to that reimbursement. Hoddan was abruptly appalled. He insisted on a bonus being paid, regardless, which his lawyers had some trouble finding a legal fiction to fit. Then he brooded over his position. He wasn't a businessman. He hadn't expected to make out so well. He'd thought to have to labor for years, perhaps, to make good the injury he'd done the ship owners and merchants in order to help the emigrants from Colin. But it was all done, and here he was with a fortune and the framework of a burgeoning financial empire. He didn't like it. Gloomily, he explained matters to his attorneys. They pointed out that he had a duty, an obligation, from the nature of his unexpected success. If he let things go now, the currently thriving business of risk insurance would return to its former unimportance. His companies had taken on extra help. More bookkeepers and accountants worked for him this week than last. More male clerks, secretaries, janitors, and scrubwomen. Even more vice presidents. He would administer a serious blow to the economy of Crim if he caused a slackening of employment by letting his companies go to pot. A slackening of employment would cause a drop in retail trade, an increase in inventories, a depression in industry. Hoddan thought gloomily of his grandfather. He'd written to the old gentleman, and the emigrant fleet would have delivered the letter. He couldn't disappoint his grandfather. He morbidly accepted his attorney's advice, and they arranged immediately to take over. 41st as well as the 42nd and 3rd floors of the building their offices were in. Commerce would march on, and Hoddan headed for Darth. He had to return his crew, and there was something else, several something elses. He arrived in that solar system and put his yacht in a search orbit, listening for the call signal the spaceboat should give for him to home on. He found it deep within the gravity field of Darth. He maneuvered to come alongside, and there was blinding light everywhere. Alarms rang. Lights went out. Instruments registered impossibilities, the rockets fired crazily, and the whole ship reeled. Then a voice roared out of the communicator. "Stand and deliver. Surrender and you'll be allowed to go to ground. But if y'even hesitate, I'll hull ye and heave ye out to space without a spacesuit." Hoddan winced. Stray sparks had flown about everywhere inside the space yacht. A ball lightning bolt, even of only warning size, makes things uncomfortable when it strikes. Hoddan's fingers tingled as if they'd been asleep. He threw on the transmitter switch and said annoyedly, "Hello, grandfather. This is Bron. Have you been waiting for me long?" He heard his grandfather swear disgustedly. Not long later, a badly battered, blackened, scuffed old spacecraft came rolling up on rocket impulse and stopped with a billowing of rocket fumes. Hoddan threw a switch and used the landing grid field he'd used on Walden in another fashion. The ships came together with fine precision, lifeboat tube to lifeboat tube. He heard his grandfather swear in amazement. "That's a little trick I worked out, grandfather," said Hoddan into the transmitter. "Come aboard. I'll pass it on." His grandfather presently appeared, scowling and suspicious. His eyes shrewdly examined everything, including the loot tucked in every available space. He snorted. "All honestly come by," said Hoddan morbidly. "It seems I've got a license to steal. I'm not sure what to do with it." His grandfather stared at a placard on the wall. It said archly, "Remember, a lady is present?" Nedda had put it up. "HMMM," said his grandfather. "What's a woman doing on a pirate ship? That's what your letter talked about. They get on," said Hoddan, wincing, like mice. "You've had mice on a ship, haven't you? Come in the control room and I'll explain." He did explain, up to the point where his arrangements to pay back for a ship and cargo he'd given away turned into a runaway success, and now he was responsible for the employment of innumerable bookkeepers and clerks, and such in the insurance companies he'd come to own. There was also the fact that, as the emigrant fleet went on, some 50 more planets in all would require the attention of pirate ships from time to time, or there would be disillusionment and injury to the economic system. "Organization," said his grandfather, "does wonders for a tender conscience like you've got." "What else?" Hoddan explained the matter of his Darthian crew. Don Loris might affect to consider them disgraced because they hadn't cut his throat. Hoddan had to take care of the matter, and there was Nedda. Fanny came into the story somehow, too. Hoddan's grandfather grunted at the end. "We'll go down and talk to this Don Loris," he said pugnaciously. "I've dealt with his kind before. While we're down, your cousin Oliver'll take a look at this new grid field job. We'll put it on my ship. How about the time down below? Never land long after daybreak. Early in the morning, people ain't at their best." Hoddan looked at Darth, rotating deliberately below him. "It's not too late, sir," he said. "Will you follow me down?" His grandfather nodded briskly, took another comprehensive look at the loot from Walden, and crawled back through the tube to his own ship. So it was not too long after dawn in that time zone when a sentry on the battlements of Don Loris Castle felt a shadow over his head. He jumped a foot and stared upward. Then his hair stood up on end and almost threw his steel helmet off. He stared, unable to move a muscle. There was a ship above him. It was not a large ship, but he could not judge of such matters. It was not supported by rockets. It should have been falling horribly to smash him under its weight. It wasn't. Instead, it floated on with very fine precision, like a ship being landed by grid, and settled delicately to the ground some 50 yards from the base of the castle wall. Immediately thereafter, there was a muttering roar. It grew to a howl, a bellow. It became thunder. It increased from that to a noise so stupendous that it ceased altogether to be heard, and was only felt as a deep-toned battering at one's chest. When it ended, there was a second ship, resting in the middle of a very large scorched place close by the first. Neither of these ships was a spaceboat. The silently landed vessel, which was the smaller of the two, was several times the sizes of the only spacecraft ever seen on Darth outside the spaceport. Its design was somehow suggestive of a yacht. The other larger ship was blunt and soiled and space-worn, with patches on its plating here and there. A landing ramp dropped down from the battered craft. It neatly spanned the scorched and still-smoking patch of soil. A port opened. Men came out, following a jaunty small figure with belligerent gray whiskers. They dragged an enigmatic object behind them. Hoddan came out of the yacht. His grandfather said waspishly, "This the castle?" He waved at the massive pile of cut gray stone with walls 20 feet thick and 60 high. "Yes, sir," said Hoddan. Snorted his grandfather. "Looks flimsy to me." He waved his hand again. "You remember your cousins?" Illier, matter-of-fact nods came from the men of the battered ship. Hoddan hadn't seen any of them for years, but they were his kin. They wore commonplace, workaday garments, but carried weapons slung negligently over their shoulders. They dragged the cryptic object behind them without particular formation or apparent discipline, but somehow they looked capable. Hoddan and his grandfather strolled to the castle gate, their companions a little. At their rear, they came to the gate. Nothing happened. Nobody challenged. There was the feel of peevish refusal to associate with persons who landed in spaceships. "Shall we hail?" asked Hoddan. "Nah," snorted his grandfather. "I know his kind. Make him make the advances." He waved to his descendants. "Open it up." Somebody casually pulled back a cover and reached in and threw switches. "Found a power broadcast unit," grunted Hoddan. "His grandfather, on a ship we took. Hooked it to the ship's space drive. When you can't use the space drive, you still got power. Your cousin Oliver whipped this thing up to use it." The enigmatic object made a spiteful noise. The castle gate shuddered and fell halfway from its hinges. The thing made a second noise. Stones splintered and began to collapse. Hoddan admired. 3 more unpleasing but not violently loud sounds. Half the wall on either side of the gate was rubble, collapsing partly inside and partly outside the castle's proper boundary. Figures began to wave hysterically from the battlements. Hoddan's grandfather yawned slightly. "I always like to talk to people," he observed, "when they're worrying about what I'm likely to do to them, instead of what maybe they can do to me." Figures appeared on the ground level. They'd come out of a sally port to one side. They were been extravagantly cordial when Hoddan's grandfather admitted that it might be convenient to talk over his business inside the castle, where there would be an easy chair to sit in. Presently they sat beside the fireplace in the great hall. Don Loris, jittering, shivered next to Hoddan's grandfather. The Lady Fanny appeared, icy cold and defiant. She walked with frigid dignity to a place beside her father. Hoddan's grandfather regarded her with a wicked, estimating gaze. "Not bad," he said brightly. Not bad at all. Then he turned to Hoddan. Those retainers coming on the way, said Hoddan. He was not happy. The Lady Fanny had passed her eyes over him exactly as if he did not exist. There was a murmurous noise. The dozen spearmen came marching into the great hall. They carried loot. It dripped on the floor, and they blandly ignored such things as stray golden koi. It was rolling off away from them. Stay-at-home inhabitants of the castle gazed at them in joyous wonderment. Nedda came with them. The Lady Fanny made a very slight, almost imperceptible movement. Hoddan said desperately, Fanny, I know you hate me, though I can't guess why. But here's a thing that has to be taken care of. We made a raid on Walden. That's where the loot came from, and my men kidnapped this girl. Her name is Nedda. And brought her on the ship as a present to me, because she'd admitted that she knew me. Nedda's in an awful fix, Fanny. She's alone and friendless, and somebody has to take care of her. Her father'll come for her eventually, no doubt, but somebody's got to take care of her in the meantime, and I can't do it. Hoddan felt hysterical at the bare idea. I can't. The Lady Fanny looked at Nedda, and Nedda wore the brave look of a girl so determinedly sweet that nobody could possibly bear it. I'm very sorry, said Nedda bravely, that I've been the cause of poor Bron turning pirate and getting into such dreadful trouble. I cry over it every night before I go to sleep. He treated me as if I were his sister, and the other men were so gentle and respectful that I think it will break my heart when they are punished, when I think of them being executed with all that dreadful, hopeless formality. On Darth, said the Lady Fanny practically, we're not very formal about such things. Just cutting somebody's throat is usually enough. But he treated you like a sister, did he? Thal swallowed. He'd been beaming a moment before, with his arms full of silver plate, jewelry, laces, and other bits of booty from the town of Ensfield. But now he said desperately, Yes, 80 Fanny, but not the way I'd have treated my sister. My sisters, Lady Fanny, bit me when they were little, slapped me when they were bigger, and scorned me when I grew up. I'm fond of 'em. But if one of my sisters ever lectured me because I wasn't refined, or shook a finger at me because I wasn't gentlemanly, Lady Fanny, I'd have strangled her. There was a certain gleam in the Lady Fanny's eye as she said warmly to Hoddan, Of course I'll take care of the poor thing. I'll let her sleep with my maids, and I'm sure one of them can spare clothes for her to wear, and I'll take care of her until a space liner comes along and she can be shipped back to her family. And you can come to see her whenever you please to make sure she's all right. Hoddan's eyes tended to grow wild. His grandfather cleared his throat loudly. Hoddan said doggedly, You, Fanny, asked each of my men if they'd fight for you. They said yes. You sent them to cut my throat. They didn't, but they're not disgraced. I want that clear. They're good men. They're not disgraced for failing to assassinate me. Of course they aren't, conceded the Lady Fanny sweetly. Whoever heard of such a thing? Hoddan wiped his forehead. Don Loris opened his mouth fretfully. Hoddan's grandfather forestalled him. You've heard about that big pirate fleet that's been floating around these parts? It's my grandson's. I run a squadron of it for him. Wonderful boy, my grandson. Bloodthirsty crews on those ships, but they love that boy. Very, Don Loris caught his breath. Very interesting. He likes your men, confided Hoddan's grandfather. Used them twice. Says they make nice, well-behaved pirates. He's going to give them stun pistols and cannon like the one that smashed your gate. Only. And on Darth with guns like that. Seize the spaceport and put in power broadcast and make sure nobody else gets stun weapons. Run the country. Your men'll love it. Love that boy, too. Follow him anywhere. Loot. Don Loris quivered. It was horribly plausible. He'd had the scheme of the only stun weapon-armed force on Darth himself. He knew his men tended to revere Hoddan because of the plunder his followers seemed always to acquire. Don Loris was in a very, very uncomfortable situation. Bored men from the battered spacecraft stood about his great hall. They were unimpressed. He knew that they at least were casually sure that they could bring his castle down about his ears in minutes if they chose. If my men, Don Loris quavered. What about me? Minor problem, said Hoddan's grandfather blandly. The usual thing would be PFFT, cut your throat. Oat, he rose. Decide that later, no doubt. Yes, Bron. I've brought back my men, growled Hoddan, and Nedda's taken care of. We're through here. He headed abruptly for the great hall's farthest door. His grandfather followed him briskly, and the negligent, matter-of-fact armed men who were mostly Hoddan's first and second cousins came after them. Outside the castle, Hoddan said angrily, Why did you tell such a preposterous story? Grandfather? It's not preposterous, said his grandfather. Sounds like fun to me. You're tired now, Bron. Lots of responsibilities and such. Take a rest. You and your cousin Oliver get together and fix those new gadgets on my ship. I'll take the other boys for a run over to this spaceport town. The boys need a run ashore and there might be some loot. Your grandmother's fond of homespun. I'll try to pick some up for her. Hoddan shrugged. His grandfather was a law unto himself. Hoddan saw his cousins bringing horses from the castle stables, and a very casual group went riding away as if on a pleasure excursion. As a matter of fact, it was. Thal guided them. For the rest of that morning and part of the afternoon, Hoddan and his cousin Oliver worked at the battered ship's Lawler Drive. Hoddan was pleased with his cousin's respect for his device. He unfeignedly admired the cannon his cousin had designed. Presently they reminisced about their childhood. It was pleasant to renew family ties like this. The riders came back about sunset. There were extra horses with loads. There were cheerful shoutings. His grandfather came into Hoddan's ship. Brought back some company, he said. Spaceliner landed while we were there. Friend of yours on it. Congenial fellow, Bron. Thinks well of you too. A large figure. Followed his grandfather in. A large figure with snow-white hair. The amiable and relaxed interstellar ambassador to Walden. Hard-gaited horses, Hoddan, he said wryly. I want a chair and a drink. I traveled a good many light years to see you, and it wasn't necessary after all. I've been talking to your grandfather. Glad to see you, sir, said Hoddan reservedly. His cousin Oliver brought glasses, and the ambassador buried his nose in. Isn't said in satisfaction. That's good, capable man, your grandfather. I watched him loot that town. Beautifully professional job. He got some homespun sheets for your grandmother, but about you. Hoddan sat down. His grandfather puffed and was silent. His cousins effaced themselves. The ambassador waved a hand. I started here, he observed, because it looked to me like you were running wild. That space fleet now, I knows. Something of your ability. I thought you'd contrived some way to fake it. I knew there couldn't be such a fleet. Not really. That was a sound job you did with the emigrants, by the way. Most praiseworthy. And the point was that if you ran hogwilled with a faked fleet, sooner or later the space patrol would have to cut you down to size. And you were doing much too good work to be stopped. Hoddan blinked. Satisfaction, said the ambassador, is enough. But satiety is death. Walden was dying on its feet. Nobody could imagine a greater satisfaction than curling up with a good tranquilizer. You've ended that? I left Walden the day after your Insfield raid. Young men were already trying to grow mustaches. The textile mills were making colored felt for garments. Jewelers were turning out stun-gun pins for ornaments, Darthian knives for brooches, and the songwriters had 8 new tunes on the air about pirate lovers, pirate queens, and dark ships that roam the lanes of night. 3 new Vision Play series were to start that same night with space piracy as their theme, and one of them claimed to be based on your life. Better make them pay for that, Hoddan. In short, Walden had rediscovered the pleasure to be had by taking pains to make a fool of oneself. People who watched that raid on vision screens had thrills they'd never swap for tranquilizers, and the ones who actually mixed in with the pirate raiders. You deserve well of the Republic, Hoddan, Hoddan said, HMMM, because there was nothing else to be said. Now, your grandfather and I have canvassed the situation thoroughly. This good work must be continued. Diplomatic service has been worried all along the line. Now we've something to work up. Your grandfather will expand his facility and snatch ships, land and loot, and keep piracy flying. Your job is to carry on the insurance business. The ships that will be snatched will be your ships, of course. No interference with legitimate commerce. The landing raids will be paid for by the interplanetary piracy risk insurance companies, In time, you'll probably have to get writers to do scripts for them, but not right away. You'll continue to get rich, but there's no harm in that so long as you reintroduce romance and adventure and daring-do to a galaxy headed for decline. Savages will not invent themselves if there are plenty of heroic characters of your making. To slap them down, Hoddan said painfully. I like working on electronic gadgets. My cousin Oliver and I have some things we want to work on together. His grandfather snorted. One of the cousins came in from outside the yacht. That followed him, glowing. He'd reported the looting of the spaceport town, and Don Loris had gone into a tantrum of despair because nobody seemed able to make headway against these strangers. Now he'd turned about and issued a belated invitation to Hoddan and his grandfather and their guest, the interstellar ambassador, of whom he'd learned from Thal, to dinner at the castle. They could bring their own guards. Hoddan would have refused, but the ambassador and his grandfather were insistent. Ultimately, he found himself seated drearily at a long table in a stone-walled room lighted by very smoky torches. Don Loris, jittering, displayed a sort of professional conversational charm. He was making an urgent effort to overcome the bad effect of past actions by conversational brilliance. The Lady Fanny sat quietly with jewels at her throat. She looked most often at her plate. The talk of the oldsters became profound. They talked administration. They talked practical politics. They talked economics. The Lady Fanny looked very bored as the talk went on after the meal was over. Don Loris said brightly to her, "My dear, we must be tedious. Young Hoddan looks uninterested, too. Why don't you two walk on the battlements and talk about such things as persons your age find interesting?" Hoddan rose, gloomy. The Lady Fanny, with a sigh of polite resignation, rose to accompany him. The ambassador said suddenly, "Hoddan, I forgot to tell you. They found out what killed that man outside the power station." When Hoddan showed no comprehension, the ambassador explained, "The man your friend Derec thought was killed by death rays. It develops that he'd gotten a terrific load on, drunk, you know, and climbed a tree to escape the pink, purple, and green. Durias he thought were chasing him to gore him. He climbed too high, a branch broke, and he fell and was killed. I'll take it up with the court when I get back to Walden. No reason to lock you up anymore, you know. You might even sell the power board on using your receptor now." "Thanks," said Hoddan politely. He added, "Don Loris has that Derec and a cop from Walden here now. Tell them that and they may go home. Here come." Panied the Lady Fanny to the battlements. The stars were very bright. They strolled. Remembering his Darthians, he felt very unpopular. "What was that the ambassador told you?" she asked. He explained without zest. He added morbidly that it didn't matter. He could go back to Walden now, and if the ambassador was right, he could even accomplish things in electronics there. But he wasn't interested. It was odd that he'd once thought such things would make him happy. "I thought," said the Lady Fanny in gentle melancholy, "that I would be happier with you dead. You had made me very angry, no matter how, but I found it was not so." Hoddan fumbled for her meaning. It wasn't quite an apology for trying to get him killed, but at least it was a disclaimer of future intentions in that direction. "And speaking of happiness," she added in a different tone, "this Nedda, he Durden," she said. "I talked to her, so then I sent for Gek. We're on perfectly good terms again, you know. I introduced him to Nedda. She was vanilla ice cream with meringue and maple syrup on it. He loved it. She gazed at him with pretty sadness and told him how terrible it was of him to kidnap me. He said humbly that he'd never had her ennobling influence nor dreamed that she existed. And she loved that. They go together. Ike strawberries and cream, I had to leave or stop being a lady. I think I made a match." Then she said tranquilly, "But seriously, you ought to be perfectly happy. You've everything you ever said you wanted except a delightful girl to marry." Hoddan squirmed. "We're old friends," said Fanny kindly, "and you did me a great favor once. I'll return it. I'll round up some really delightful girls for you to look over." "I'm leaving," said Hoddan, alarmed. "The only thing is I don't know what type you like. Nedda isn't it?" Hoddan shuddered. "Nor I," said Fanny. "What type would you say I was?" "Delightful," said Hoddan hoarsely. The Lady Fanny stopped and looked up at him. She said approvingly, "I hoped that word would occur to you one day. What does a man usually do when he discovers a girl is delightful?" Hoddan thought it over. He started. He put his arms around her with singularly little skill. He kissed her, at first as if amazed at himself, and then with enthusiasm. There were scraping sounds on the stone nearby. Footsteps. Don Loris appeared, gazing uncertainly about. "Fanny," he said plaintively. "Hoddan, our guests are going to the spaceships. I want to speak privately to Hoddan." "Yes," said Hoddan. Don Loris peered blindly about. He kissed Fanny again. "I've been thinking," said Loris fretfully. "I've made some mistakes, my dear boy, and I've given you excellent reason to dislike me, but at bottom I've always thought a great deal of you. And There seems to be only one way in which I can properly express how much I admire you. Ah, how would you like to marry my daughter? Hoddan looked down at Fanny. She did not try to move away. What do you think of the idea, Fanny? He asked. How about marrying me tomorrow morning? Of course not, said Fanny indignantly. I wouldn't think of such a thing. I couldn't possibly get married before tomorrow afternoon.